Section 1. Where it all began. The origin of Pokémon. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that one of the most beloved and commercially successful entertainment franchises in human history started with a boy catching bugs in the countryside of Japan. Not a corporation, not a design committee, not a room full of suits with marketing research and demographic charts. Just a kid wandering through tall grass and muddy ponds, turning over rocks and peering into the hollow spaces of old trees, searching for beetles, dragonflies, crawfish, and anything else that moved. That boy's name was Satoshi Tajiri, and his childhood obsession with the natural world would quietly, slowly, almost impossibly transform into Pokémon. Fact 1. Satoshi Tajiri grew up in Machida, a suburb west of Tokyo. When he was young, in the 1960s and 70s, Machida still had something rural and unhurried about it. There were forests to explore, ponds where dragonfly larvae slept in the mud, streams with crayfish tucked under flat rocks. Tajiri spent enormous amounts of time out there alone, or with neighborhood kids, cataloging everything he found. His classmates gave him a nickname that has followed him into history: Dr. Bug. He wanted, genuinely and earnestly, to grow up and become an entomologist, a scientist who studies insects. The idea of catching and collecting small living things, of identifying them and understanding where they belonged in the world, was not just a hobby for him. It was something deeper, more like a calling. Fact 2. The physical landscape of Tajiri's childhood began disappearing around him. Urbanization crept into Machida, the way it crept into so many Japanese suburbs of that era steadily, then all at once. An arcade center was actually built over the pond where he once caught crawfish. The forests were thinned for new construction. The wetlands were filled in and paved. Tajiri watched the places where he'd spent his most formative hours get replaced by concrete and glass, and he never forgot that feeling. He told CNN in a 1999 interview that every year they would cut down the trees and the insect populations would decrease. The change was dramatic. That loss stayed with him not as bitterness, exactly, but as a kind of longing that would eventually become the emotional core of what Pokémon is and what it means. Fact 3. The same arcade that replaced his beloved crawfish pond became the site of another obsession. When Tajiri first encountered Space Invaders in 1978, at about 13 years old, something in his brain lit up. Games were not just entertainment to him, they were systems. Machines you could understand if you studied them carefully enough, exploitable if you were patient enough, and eventually masterable if you were devoted enough. He became one of those kids who could spend 8 or 10 hours on a single cabinet, not just playing, but learning, memorizing the enemy patterns, figuring out the exact timing of every movement. His obsession with the natural world had simply found a new subject. Fact 4. In 1982, when he was around 16 or 17 years old, Tajiri started a handwritten video game magazine with the help of an artist named Ken Sugimori. It was called Game Freak. The very first issue was 14 pages long, handwritten, and sold for 200 yen. It contained tips, tricks, and secrets for popular arcade games, basically a guide for people like him, people who wanted to understand the systems beneath the surface. Tajiri named the publication after his own arcade nickname, Game Freak. The magazine grew slowly but steadily over the next few years, printed more professionally as it gained readers, eventually becoming well known among the gaming community in Japan. And throughout all of it, Ken Sugimori was there drawing illustrations and helping to shape the voice and identity of the whole thing. Fact 5. Tajiri and Sugimori's partnership, two young men with complementary skills who trusted each other completely, is actually fundamental to what Pokémon became. Tajiri had the conceptual vision, the obsessive love of systems and collection. Sugimori had the artistic language to make creatures feel real, to make them feel like they had weight and texture and personality. When the Game Freak magazine wound down in 1986 after about 4 years of publication, the two of them decided they wanted to make games rather than write about them. They studied programming, studied the hardware, and in April of 1989 they officially incorporated Game Freak as a video game development company. Their first title was an arcade-style game called Quinty, published by Namco, and from there they started working towards something much larger. Fact 6. The idea for Pokémon crystallized in Tajiri's mind around 1990 when he was watching someone use the Game Boy's link cable The cable was a simple accessory, just a cord that connected two Game Boys so players could trade and battle in certain games. But Tajiri looked at that cable and saw something completely different from what everyone else saw. He saw insects traveling between two devices. He saw the image of a bug crawling along a thread from one world into another. That vision connected the two great obsessions of his life, the childhood joy of catching and collecting living things in the wild, and the adult obsession with game systems and mechanics. He immediately understood that you could build an entire game around that cable, a game where the act of trading and sharing creatures was as central as anything else. Fact 7. He pitched the concept to Nintendo as Capsule Monsters, a name that imagined miniature creatures sealed inside small containers. Nintendo liked the idea but suggested some revisions, and the name went through several iterations: Pocket Monsters, then eventually just Pokémon in Western markets. The development process that followed was one of the most difficult and prolonged in the franchise's history. The game took 6 full years to complete, from that initial pitch in 1990 to the Japanese release of Pokémon Red and Green in February of 1996. 6 years of development for a Game Boy title was extraordinary, and the strain on Game Freak was genuinely severe. There were periods where staff members went unpaid. Several people quit. Tajiri himself reportedly lived with his parents during chunks of development because he could not afford anything else. The dream was enormous and the resources were almost comically insufficient. Fact 8. Shigeru Miyamoto, the legendary Nintendo designer responsible for Mario and Zelda, served as a kind of mentor to Tajiri during those years. Tajiri looked up to Miyamoto deeply, and Miyamoto helped champion the project internally at Nintendo during the lean years when it might otherwise have been cancelled. The relationship between those two men, one who made games about exploration and adventure drawn from his own childhood countryside wandering, the other making games about creature collection drawn from his own childhood, bug catching, is one of the quieter and more moving threads in the entire history of video games. Fact 9. Ken Sugimori designed all 151 of the original Pokémon personally. Every single one. He drew each creature in watercolor for the promotional artwork, revising and refining designs that had initially been sketched by various artists for the game's early sprites. His visual style in those early days drew heavily from Akira Toriyama's work: clean lines, dynamic shapes, a quality that made things feel both fantastical and somehow plausible. Over the years, his style shifted, and different designers contributed to the expanding roster, but Sugimori remained the art director of the entire franchise for decades. Fact 10. The first Pokémon ever designed, not the first to appear in the Pokédex, not the first one most players think of, was Rhydon. This has been confirmed in interviews with Sugimori himself. Rhydon holds index number 1 inch the game's internal coding. If you look at the earliest surviving concept sketches from the Capsule Monsters era, you can see Rhydon-like figures accompanying trainers in caves, on town streets, everywhere. The designs in those early sketches leaned heavily towards something dinosaurian and powerful creatures that looked like they could physically exist, like scaled-up versions of real animals. Rhydon fits perfectly into that vision. It also explains something that Pokémon Red and Blue veterans might remember noticing without fully registering. There are statues of Rhydon everywhere in Kanto, in gyms, in corridors, outside buildings. They're so common that most players walk past them without a second thought. But those statues are a kind of quiet monument, a nod to where the whole franchise actually started. Fact 11. Pokémon Red and Green launched in Japan on the 27th of February 1996. The reception was, at first, genuinely underwhelming. Sales were modest. Reviews were polite but not rapturous. Nintendo and Game Freak were not sure they had a hit on their hands. The Game Boy hardware was aging newer, more powerful portable systems were already available, and there was a real possibility that Pokémon would simply come and go without leaving much of a mark. What changed everything was word of mouth, and more specifically, a rumor. Fact 12. A hidden Pokémon named Mew could supposedly be found in the game. Nobody could quite agree on how to find it. Some kids said you needed to push a specific truck near the SS Anne. Others claimed you had to trade with a particular person. The rumors spread through elementary school playgrounds like something alive, jumping from kid to kid, each telling building on the last. Game Freak had actually hidden a Mew in the game's code before the cartridges went to manufacturing a genuine secret, placed there by a programmer named Shigeki Morimoto without Tajiri's knowledge, accessible only through a specific sequence of movements and interactions that exploited the game's memory. The existence of Mew as a real secret, rather than just a rumor, gave the whole thing an almost mythological quality. Kids who had the game talked about it endlessly. Kids who didn't have the game wanted it specifically because of Mew. Slowly, steadily, Pokémon became an unstoppable phenomenon. Fact 13. Pokémon Blue was released in Japan a few months later as a special magazine promotion version with different Pokémon availability and updated sprite artwork. When the games reached North America in September of 1998, Nintendo combined elements of Red and Green, the two original Japanese games, and released them alongside a localized version of Blue. The sprite artwork for the Western Blue release was generally cleaner and more polished than the original Red and Green sprites, which had a rougher, sometimes almost grotesque quality that veteran fans occasionally feel a certain nostalgia for. The early sprites had personality and strangeness, a rawness that later, cleaner versions smoothed away. Fact 14. The link cable that inspired the entire franchise almost didn't matter for the game's early success. When Pokémon first launched in Japan, relatively few players were actually using the trading and battling features that had been central to Tajiri's original vision. Most kids were just catching Pokémon and working through the single-player adventure. It wasn't until the franchise had already built up its audience that the social and competitive dimensions of the game really began to flourish. The idea was always correct. Trading and battling with friends would become central pillars of the Pokémon experience. It just took time for the infrastructure of friendship and widespread ownership to develop enough for those mechanics to reach their potential. Fact 15. Ash Ketchum, the protagonist of the anime that launched the following year, is named Satoshi in Japanese. The naming was intentional and affectionate, a tribute from the creative team to the man whose childhood obsession had set all of this in motion. His English name, Ash Ketchum, was an adaptation chosen during localization. Ash because it was one of the default player names available in Red and Blue, and Ketchum as a punning reference to the franchise's original tagline. The character was designed to reflect what Tajiri was like as a child, restless, curious, determined, a kid who got up early and ran out the door into the world to see what he could find. If you're watching this late at night, or early in the morning, or somewhere in between while the rest of your world is quiet, drop a comment and let me know where you are and what time it is. And if you haven't already, a subscribe costs you nothing and it genuinely helps more than you know. Now, let's keep going. Section 2. Red, Blue, and the Wild Frontier of Kanto. The original Kanto games were built in circumstances that would alarm any modern game developer: minimal resources, outdated hardware, a skeleton crew, and a publishing timeline that kept slipping year after year. What emerged from those conditions was something genuinely peculiar and alive. The games were full of quirks, accidental discoveries, hidden corners, and programming solutions that became beloved features. They were imperfect in the most interesting possible way. Fact 16. The Pokédex was not originally designed to be the sleek digital encyclopedia that players know today. Early development sketches show it imagined as a physical notebook, a battered field journal that a trainer would carry and fill in by hand as they encountered creatures. The shift toward a high-tech gadget came as Game Freak leaned into the game's underlying aesthetic of a world balanced between natural wonder and human invention. Making the Pokédex futuristic gave the world a kind of internal consistency. Trainers had advanced tools, but they were still fundamentally explorers moving through a world full of wild, untamed things. The notebook idea was completely abandoned, but there is something poetic about it. The original vision was a trainer scribbling field notes in margins, pressing insects between pages. Tajiri's childhood self, essentially, translated into a mechanic. Fact 17. Professor Oak, the gentle intellectual who sends young trainers out into the world with their first Pokémon, was not originally intended to be battled in the game. But there is unused trainer data in the code for all first-generation games for a version of Oak with a full team. He was going to be a final challenge after the Elite Four. After the champion, you were going to face the professor himself. The team was strong, and the encounter was fully programmed. It was cut before release, possibly because the developers felt it disrupted the pacing, or possibly because there just wasn't enough space on the cartridge. Fans have been wanting that battle for 30 years, and modders have restored it in countless fan projects. Fact 18. The move, Focus Energy, in the original Red and Blue games, did not do what it said it would do. The move was supposed to increase the user's critical hit ratio. Due to a coding error, it actually quartered the critical hit rate instead of multiplying it. This bug went unnoticed for an extraordinarily long time because the critical hit mechanic in Generation 1 was already so different from later games. It was based primarily on speed, not the typical mechanic players know from later generations, that the negative effect of focus energy was easy to miss unless you were paying very close analytical attention. Players who used it simply found that their Pokémon seemed to land critical hits less often, shrugged, and moved on. The mistake wasn't patched. It wasn't corrected until the mechanic was redesigned in Generation 2. Fact 19. The Viridian City Gym is locked until late in the game, and if you venture inside too early you find nothing. But the gym's design was apparently built around a specific plan for its leader. Giovanni, the rocket boss, was programmed and placed there deliberately, and the sequence of events that leads to discovering his dual identity leader of Team Rocket and legitimate gym leader both was one of the game's most surprising narrative threads. What many players never discovered is that the game contains dialogue for a scenario where Giovanni simply never shows up to defend his gym, and the player receives the Earth Badge from a completely different trainer. That alternative path was never intended to be accessed, but the text is there, sitting quietly in the code. Fact 20. Lavender Town, the small gray settlement built around the Pokémon Tower where deceased Pokémon are buried, became one of the most mythologized locations in the franchise's history for reasons that go well beyond its spooky atmosphere. The original music, composed for Lavender Town in the Japanese Red and Green games, had a specific quality that genuinely unsettled some players. This gave rise to an internet urban legend known as Lavender Town Syndrome, which claimed the music caused health problems and suicides in Japanese children. This is entirely false. The story is a creepypasta that was fabricated and spread online years after the game's release. But the music's genuine eeriness, combined with the location's morbid purpose, made it fertile ground for exactly that kind of mythology. The actual Japanese Red and Green music was later changed slightly for international releases, but not because of health concerns, just routine localization adjustments. Fact 21. The Safari Zone in Kanto was directly inspired by real-world wildlife reserves and safari parks. Tajiri wanted a section of the game that captured something of the feel of observing nature in the wild, the unpredictability, the sensation that you are a visitor in someone else's territory rather than a conqueror of it. That's why players don't battle in the Safari Zone the way they do everywhere else. Instead, they throw bait or rocks attempts to manage the behavior of a wild creature without directly overpowering it. The throwing mechanic is counterintuitive in ways that even its designers admitted. Throwing bait makes Pokémon harder to catch overall despite seeming like it should help, and throwing rocks increases the chance of the Pokémon fleeing. The system was designed to feel chaotic and unpredictable on purpose, because that's what encountering something genuinely wild actually feels like. Fact 22. There is an invisible PC in a house in Celadon City. If you press the action button on a specific tile in one of the buildings, the game responds as if you're interacting with a PC box even though there is no visible PC in the room. This happened because the developers copied map data from another building when constructing the Celadon area and forgot to remove the PC interaction script from the pasted data. It's completely harmless. You can withdraw and deposit Pokémon normally from thin air. Players who discovered it in the 90s treated it like a significant secret, debating what hidden meaning it might have, whether there were items tied to it, whether it led somewhere. It led nowhere. It was just a leftover accident. But the fact that people built theories around it for years says something interesting about how the human mind confronts unexplained things, especially unexplained things in a world where secrets genuinely existed. Fact 23. The Sylph Scope, an item needed to identify ghost-type Pokémon in the Pokémon Tower, was designed around a gameplay loop that rewarded thoroughness. But there are unused items in the code that suggest other methods of revealing ghosts were considered, including what appears to be a rival device to the Sylph Scope that would have allowed players to communicate with ghost types rather than fight them. The text strings attached to this unused item are fragmentary and hard to interpret definitively. But the concept of conversing with Pokémon rather than battling them gestures towards something more quietly strange and interesting than what made it into the final game. Fact 24. Snorlax, the enormous sleeping creature who blocks two major routes in Kanto, was based on a real person. Ken Sugimori designed Snorlax after a Game Freak employee named Koji Nishino, whose habits of sleeping, eating, and general contentment were apparently well known and affectionately teased within the studio. Nishino later became a significant figure at Game Freak and the Pokémon Company, eventually working on everything from distribution events to competitive game design. There is something genuinely charming about the fact that one of the most recognizable Pokémon in the franchise was essentially a friendly caricature of a colleague. Fact 25. The move Splash, forever associated with Magikarp's helpless flopping and famous in competitive play for doing absolutely nothing, is not actually about water in its original Japanese design. In Japanese, the move is called Haneru, which means to hop or jump. Magikarp's move is about its frantic, desperate flopping on land the way a fish out of water thrashes and leaps uselessly. The English translation of Splash implied water, which suddenly made no sense when non-water Pokémon like Hoppip, a grass-type dandelion creature, learned the move later. Hoppip's entire design is built around floating and drifting through the air. It has nothing to do with splashing. But the mistranslation was already embedded in the franchise's language by then, and you can't exactly rename a move that has become part of the culture. Fact 26. The glitch city accessible through the Safari Zone in Red and Blue became one of the stranger accidental discoveries in the game's history. By saving and resetting in the Safari Zone at precisely the right moment, players could escape the boundary of the game's map data and wander into a corrupted version of reality, where tiles from different maps overlapped chaotically, walls didn't stop movement, and the layout of the world was replaced by something that looked like a fever dream built from recycled assets. Players called it Glitch City and treated it with the same reverence they gave to real locations, exploring it carefully, mapping what they found, sharing discoveries. It was completely accidental. It was also, in its strange, broken way, genuinely fascinating. Fact 27. The bicycle in Pokémon Red and Blue cost 1 million Pokédollars at the Cerulean City Bike Shop, a price so enormous it was simply impossible to afford through normal gameplay. You could never buy it. The game expected you to receive a bike voucher from the Pokémon fan club chairman in Vermilion City as a reward for listening to him talk about his Pokémon. This was always the intended path. But several generations of players experienced a specific moment of confusion, discovering the bike shop early, seeing the price, doing the math, realizing with slow horror that they didn't have remotely enough money, and then wondering if they were supposed to be grinding for currency in a way the game hadn't told them about. Some players actually did try to earn 1 million Pokédollars. It cannot be done. The price was just a joke about how expensive bikes are. Fact 28. The Trainer Fly glitch, which allows players to encounter Mew in Pokémon Red and Blue through a very specific sequence of actions, works because the game stores encounter data in working memory when a trainer spots you. If you trigger a trainer battle, use Fly or Teleport to escape before the battle starts, and manipulate the sequence of events precisely enough, you can force the game to load encounter data that has been corrupted into producing a Mew battle. The glitch wasn't intended and wasn't hidden. It emerged from a collision between the game's memory management for trainer battles and its encounter system. But for kids in the 90s, finding it felt like pulling magic from a machine. It was the closest thing to actually discovering a secret that the playground rumors had always promised was there. Fact 29. Missing No, arguably the most famous glitch in gaming history, is not one thing but many. The name stands for missing number, and it refers to a collection of placeholder data slots in the game's Pokémon index. When Game Freak wrote the code for Pokémon Red and Green, they built the game around an 8-bit variable system that required a total of 256 slots to function properly. They only designed 151 Pokémon. Rather than filling those remaining 105 slots with carefully coded blank entries, they left them with fragmentary leftover data remnants of cut Pokémon designs, leftover sprites from testing, random bit patterns. When the game encountered those empty slots through the famous Cinnabar Island surfing glitch or the Old Man exploit, it did its best to render whatever it found. The result was Missing No, a backwards L of scrambled pixels that could be caught, trained, and which carried a type that had been deleted from the final game, the bird type, a beta classification that was replaced by flying before launch. Fact 30. There are actually 39 distinct missing no variants in red and blue, each assembled from different fragments of deleted or unfinished code. Some of them are genuinely dangerous to your save file. The most famous, the backwards L, is relatively harmless. It duplicates the sixth item in your inventory to a count of over 128, which can give you unlimited items if used carefully, and is the reason so many 90s kids had 153 rare candies. But other variants, particularly one called M with a tick mark, could corrupt save data in ways that were difficult or impossible to recover from. Nintendo officially described missing no as a programming quirk and warned players not to save after encountering it. They never patched it. The glitch was already so embedded in the culture of the game that addressing it would have changed something fundamental about that era of Pokémon. Fact 31. The department store in Celadon City has rooftop vending machines that sell drinks, and these drinks can be given to the thirsty gatekeepers, blocking certain routes as a much cheaper alternative to buying their required items. But if you look at the vending machine text carefully, you find a line suggesting that players could return empty bottles for some kind of reward or credit. There is no mechanic to actually do this in the final game. No empty bottle item, no NPC to receive it, no reward system. The text is all that remains of what appears to have been a scrapped recycling feature. Given that the Safari Zone was designed around ideas of observing and respecting nature, this tiny remnant of a recycling system suggests that environmental themes were at least briefly considered for incorporation into the game's systems in a more active way. Fact 32. The game's internal data contains unused trainer battle data for Professor Oak, as mentioned earlier, but it also contains unused data for a battle against a trainer named after the Japanese word for shadow, a trainer with no associated dialogue, no location in any map, and a team of Pokémon at extremely high levels. The exact identity and intended purpose of this trainer has never been satisfactorily explained, and the data has been pored over by fans and data miners for decades without a definitive conclusion. It might be leftover from a cut post-game storyline. It might be a debug trainer used during internal testing. It might be something stranger. The fact that it sits there, nameless and unexplained in the most analyzed game code in history, is one of the quieter mysteries in the franchise. Fact 33. The entire Vermilion City SS and sequence where players board a luxury ship, fight trainers, receive HM cut, and watch the ship sail away forever contains a persistent urban legend about a truck near the dock after the ship departs. The truck is real. You can see it if you surf to the right area after the Anne has left. For decades, kids believed with absolute conviction that Mew was hidden under the truck and could be obtained if you used strength on it. The truck does nothing when you use strength on it. Mew is not underneath it. The truck is just a piece of scenery. But it became such a powerful part of Pokémon mythology that Game Freak themselves eventually acknowledged it decades later in Pokémon Sun and Moon, where a parked truck appears near the harbor of a port town, a knowing, playful nod to one of the most famous false rumors in gaming history. Fact 34. The Safari Zone was originally going to use a time limit rather than a step counter. Players would have been given a countdown clock and forced to catch as many Pokémon as possible before time ran out, a frantic race rather than a measured walk. The step-based system was chosen because it was simpler to program with the hardware available. But consider how different the experience would have been with a ticking clock. The Safari Zone, as players actually experienced it, had a strange, unhurried quality. You wandered, you threw bait, you waited. Things fled unpredictably. A timer would have replaced all of that with urgency. The slower, more contemplative version of the Safari Zone feels much more aligned with Tajiri's original vision of simulating nature observation, so perhaps the practical limitation of using steps rather than seconds accidentally preserved something essential about the design intent. Fact 35. Pokémon Yellow was designed in large part in response to the anime rather than preceding it. By the time the game was being developed, the anime had already aired, and Ash and Pikachu's relationship had become the defining image of the franchise. Yellow reimagined the red and blue adventure through that lens, giving the player a Pikachu that followed them around and reacted emotionally to how it was treated. The following mechanic was originally planned for all starter Pokémon. The idea was that whichever partner you chose would trail behind you through the whole game. The hardware simply couldn't handle rendering multiple different overworld sprites for different Pokémon, while also managing all the other processes the game needed to run. So, Pikachu alone got the feature. That limitation held for over a decade until Heart Gold and Soul Silver finally delivered the original vision. Section 3. Gold, Silver, and the Revolution of Johto. If Red and Blue built the foundation, Gold and Silver built the cathedral. They expanded the scope of what Pokémon could be in ways that feel almost miraculous when you consider the constraints involved. A real-time clock, day and night cycles, 2 full regions, a phone system, friendship mechanics that could evolve certain Pokémon, breeding, 100 new creatures, all of this running on the Game Boy Color, a machine that had been designed as an upgrade to hardware that was already aging when Pokémon Red launched. Fact 36. The day and night system in Gold and Silver nearly didn't happen. The Game Boy Color had strict memory limitations, and storing multiple color palettes for every map in the game, one for daytime, one for evening, one for night, consumed an extraordinary amount of the available space. There were serious internal debates about whether to cut the feature entirely in order to free up that memory for other things. The decision to keep it fundamentally changed not just Pokémon but the gaming industry's relationship with real-world time. Gold and Silver demonstrated that you could build a game that was aware of when you were playing it, that shifted its world to match the actual hour. Animal Crossing, one of the most influential game franchises of the 21st century, owes a clear debt to what Gold and Silver proved was possible. Fact 37. The internal clock system was so new, so untested in consumer gaming, that Nintendo worried players would resist it. Developers briefly considered making the time system optional. Players could toggle it off and play in a static time environment if they preferred. That option was eventually removed. The experience was going to be tied to real time whether you liked it or not, and overwhelmingly, players loved it. The specific quality of finding a different set of Pokémon at night, of meeting Usein on a rainy afternoon, of hearing the cricket sounds and seeing the sky change color as you played into the evening, all of that enriched the world in a way that a static game simply couldn't replicate. Fact 38. Lugia, the silver legendary mascot of Pokémon Silver, was not originally created for the games at all. It was designed by Takeshi Shudo, the chief writer of the Pokémon anime, specifically for the second theatrical film, Pokémon the Movie 2000. The film's production and the game's development were running on parallel tracks, and when Lugia became enormously popular with audiences who saw early promotional material for the movie, Game Freak made the decision to include it in the Silver game as that version's mascot legendary. Shudo was reportedly surprised and somewhat displeased by this decision. He felt Lugia belonged to the film and had not anticipated the character being taken into the main game series. Lugia is now one of the most recognizable Pokémon in the franchise's history. It's fascinating to think that it almost existed only in a movie. Fact 39. The Space World, 1997 demo of Pokémon Gold and Silver. An early prototype shown at a Nintendo trade event in Japan contained a roster of Pokémon that looked dramatically different from the final games and included many creatures that were never released. In 2018, a ROM of the demo surfaced online after reportedly being recovered from a cartridge found in a second-hand store following the death of a collector. Data miners descended on it immediately. What they found was extraordinary. The demo contained pre-evolutions for several existing Pokémon that had never made it to the final game, early forms of Meowth, Doduo, and Ditto among them. It included scrapped evolutions for creatures like Farfetch'd, a graceful bird called Madam, and Pinsir, and it contained Pokémon that bore no resemblance to anything in the finished games. Strange, beautiful designs that had simply been cut at some point in the years between the 1997 demo and the 1999 release. Fact 40. One of the most significant scrapped Pokémon from the Gold and Silver era is Gorochu, what would have been the final evolution of Pikachu beyond Raichu. Gorochu was described as having fangs and horns, a significantly more aggressive design than the round cheerfulness of Raichu. The Pikachu evolutionary line was deliberately shortened before release, reportedly because the developers wanted to leave room for Pikachu itself to remain the recognizable face of the franchise without being overshadowed by a more powerful final form. Whether the decision was made for merchandising reasons, narrative reasons, or simply aesthetic preference has never been fully confirmed. Gorochu remains a fascinating ghost in the franchise's history, the evolution that almost was. Fact 41. Shiny Pokémon, those rare alternate-colored variants that have become one of the franchise's most beloved features, were introduced in gold and silver through an extremely practical decision. Developers were testing the expanded color palette made possible by the Game Boy Color hardware and discovered they could flip a Pokémon's color data without requiring any significant additional memory. The shiny variants essentially cost almost nothing in technical terms to implement. What was essentially a debugging test became one of the most obsessively pursued features in the franchise. The first shiny Pokémon the player was intended to encounter a red Gyarados at the Lake of Rage. Scripted and guaranteed was also designed as a narrative beat, drawing attention to what Team Rocket was doing in Johto. The red Gyarados was simultaneously an introduction to shinies and a piece of storytelling. The combination was elegant. Fact 42. The breeding system introduced in gold and silver was added partly because of Ditto. Developers realized that some Pokémon would be extremely difficult for players to obtain in sufficient quantities without a universal partner, something that could breed with almost any species, regardless of type or evolutionary line. Ditto, with its existing identity as a shapeshifter, was the natural choice for that role. What's interesting is that the mechanic was added relatively late in development, specifically to solve a logistical problem about game balance and accessibility. The design of Ditto happened to support the function perfectly, which meant what could have felt awkward or arbitrary instead felt like it made complete sense within the fiction of the world. Fact 43. There is an unused Safari Zone map coded into Pokémon Gold and Silver. The Johto games remove the Safari Zone as a location. There is no functional Safari Zone in the main Johto experience, but the map data and structure for one still exists within the code, accessible through cheat devices. Players who explored it found an empty area with no Pokémon, no NPCs, and no exits. Why it was built and then abandoned is unclear. Was it originally planned for Johto? Was it a leftover from an earlier version of the game? The mystery held for years. Then Heart Gold and Soul Silver introduced a full, expansive Safari Zone in the remakes, one of the most ambitious in the series, with the ability to customize what Pokémon appeared based on objects you placed. It felt like an answer to a question the original game had left deliberately open. Fact 44. The friendship mechanic, which allows certain Pokémon like Togepi, Espeon, and Umbreon to evolve based on how much they like you, was tied to a hidden step counter that many players triggered without knowing it. The game calculates friendship increases in intervals of 256 steps. When you reach that threshold, your Pokémon's friendship goes up by a point. Players who simply walked through the overworld in the normal course of playing were unconsciously building their bond with their Pokémon at a specific rate determined by a number they could not see and had never been told about. Hundreds of players got Espeon or Umbreon without understanding exactly why it happened when it did, experiencing the evolution as a pleasant surprise that seemed to come from nowhere. Fact 45. The bug-catching contest in the national park was originally going to have significantly higher stakes. Early build data shows that the top prize at the contest was not just a sunstone or evolutionary item. Early versions included exclusive Pokémon that could only be won through achieving high scores. These were removed before the final release, likely because locking unique creatures behind a competitive minigame would frustrate players who lacked the skill or knowledge to perform well. The Sunstone and other items that ended up as prizes were elegant solutions, useful, meaningful, but not gatekeeping anything unreachable. The leftover code for those scrapped Pokémon prizes was discovered by data miners years later, feeding speculation about which creatures were originally intended to be contest exclusive. Fact 46. The ruins of Alph, the ancient site in Johto filled with unknown puzzles and cryptic text, was originally designed with a more direct connection to Arceus, the Pokémon eventually revealed in Diamond and Pearl as the franchise's godlike creator deity. Development notes from the Gold and Silver era indicate that the unknown script in the ruins was meant to be more explicitly connected to a divine origin story, gesturing towards something vast and cosmic that the games at that point couldn't fully explore. By the time the final games shipped, those connections had been made appropriately vague, mysterious enough to be intriguing, ambiguous enough to not lock the franchise's mythology into something it might need to revise. Generation 4's revelation of Arceus felt to many longtime fans like a resolution to something the ruins of Alph had been quietly promising for nearly a decade. Fact 47. Pokémon Crystal was the first game in the mainline series to include animated Pokémon sprites, the little walking or bouncing animations that played when you entered battle. This sounds like an obvious and relatively minor feature, but it almost didn't happen. The Game Boy Color's processing power was genuinely strained by the task of animating dozens of sprites at varying rates, and at one point during development, the decision was made to cut the animations entirely because the hardware couldn't handle them without visible lag. The team eventually found a way to compress the animations heavily enough to make them work, which is why Crystal's sprite animations look so minimal and economical compared to what later games could achieve. But they made it in. The little wiggle of a Totodile entering battle, the slow pulse of Suicune, these things mattered to the people who played those games. Fact 48. The Battle Tower in Crystal was the franchise's first competitive battle facility outside the main game story. Game Freak built it as a testing environment, a place where they could try unusual AI behavior and unusual team compositions without disrupting the carefully balanced main game. Developers wanted a space where the AI would make choices that felt different from standard trainer patterns, forcing players to adapt to unexpected strategies. The Battle Tower eventually evolved across generations into the Battle Frontier, the Battle Subway, and all the other competitive post-game systems that define the depth of the franchise's endgame for dedicated players. All of it grew from that original impulse, a room where strange trainers could do strange things for testing purposes. Fact 49. The Gold and Silver era introduced the phone mechanic, the Pokegear's phone book, which would occasionally ring with calls from trainers you had defeated earlier in the game. These calls served several purposes. They could offer item tips, announce roaming legendary locations, or simply provide ambient texture to the world. But unused data in the game reveals that the phone system was originally planned to be much more elaborate. There were entire conversation trees for extended calls that were cut before release, as well as a planned mechanic where certain trainers would challenge you to rematches that you had to accept immediately or lose the opportunity. The stripped-down version of the phone system that shipped was already charming. The unused version hints at something that would have felt almost like a precursor to the social mechanics of later mobile games. Fact 50. The real-time clock in Gold and Silver had a critical vulnerability that wouldn't become apparent for several years after launch. The internal battery inside each physical cartridge powered the clock without it. The game couldn't track real time, and the clock-dependent features would stop working. As those batteries aged and eventually died, typically after 5 to 10 years, players who came back to their childhood cartridges found a world frozen in time. Berries stopped growing. The bug-catching contest never started. The clock just stopped. Nintendo eventually addressed this in Heart Gold and Soul Silver with updated battery systems, and fan communities developed methods for replacing the batteries in original cartridges. But for a significant period in the mid-2000s, there were millions of Gold and Silver cartridges with dead clocks sitting in drawers and boxes, their internal worlds quiet and still. Section 4. The Anime's Hidden History. The Pokémon anime premiered in Japan on the 1st of April 1997. About 13 months after the original games launched. It was built partly as a promotional tool for the games, and partly as a genuine attempt to tell an ongoing adventure story set in a world that millions of children already loved. What it became was something far larger than either of those ambitions, a television series that ran for over 25 years with the same protagonist, weathered multiple controversies, survived the departure and return of major characters, and shaped the cultural relationship that an entire generation of humans has with the concept of friendship, growth, and caring for living things. Fact 51. The anime almost gave Ash a Clefairy instead of Pikachu. The original Pokémon manga adaptation, a comedic series called Pocket Monsters by Kosaku Anakubo, featured a protagonist partnered with a crude, foul-mouthed, extremely unladylike Clefairy who was nothing like the anime's version of the character. Clefairy was considered the natural mascot candidate, pink, round, immediately cute, and central to the earliest promotional artwork. Test audiences and marketing studies changed the decision. Pikachu had been found to appeal equally to both boys and girls, which Clefairy's existing manga characterization complicated. Pikachu's electric powers also made for dramatically better battle visuals. Lightning bolts are more dynamic than fairy dust. And Pikachu was small, round, yellow, and uncomplicated in a way that translated into perfect merchandise. The choice was made, and Clefairy became a supporting character. Fact 52. Ash's name in Japan is Satoshi. Gary's name in Japan is Shigeru after Shigeru Miyamoto, the Nintendo legend who mentored the franchise's creator. Tracy Sketchit, the companion character who briefly replaced Brock during the Orange Islands arc, is named Kenji in Japanese after Ken Sugimori, the franchise's art director. Even Brock's Japanese name, Takeshi, is a reference that comes from Takeshi Shudo, the anime's head writer for much of its early run. The original creators embedded themselves and their collaborators into the fabric of the show in ways that international audiences almost completely missed. Fact 53. Brock was never supposed to be a permanent character. The original plan was to cycle through different gym leaders as companions for Ash, each one joining the group for a few episodes as they passed through their gym's region, then departing when the story moved on. Brock's chemistry with the group, his nurturing personality, and the audience's immediate affection for him made the rotating companion idea feel less appealing with every week he was on screen. By the time the writers seriously evaluated whether to follow through on the original plan, Brock was already clearly central. They kept him. The rotating companion concept was quietly abandoned. Fact 54. The anime originally planned to end after the Indigo League arc. The production team genuinely was not sure the show would run longer than one region's worth of material. Plans were laid to wrap the story up with Ash returning to Pallet Town. But the franchise's popularity had become so overwhelming, the games, the merchandise, the trading cards, all of it feeding back into the show's audience that continuing indefinitely became not just desirable, but effectively mandatory. This explains something that attentive viewers sometimes notice about the difference between the early Indigo arc and everything that follows. The early episodes have a more self-contained, episodic quality, like something designed to conclude. The later series began building toward longer narrative arcs precisely because they knew they had time. Fact 55. Ash was originally meant to win the Indigo League. Scripts were written and approved for him to defeat his opponents in the final rounds and become champion. Executives ultimately decided that having Ash win his first major tournament too early would remove the forward momentum from the series. There would be nothing left to strive toward, no reason for the journey to continue. The decision was made to have him lose to Richie, a relatively new rival who had appeared late in the arc, under circumstances that many fans found unsatisfying even at the time. That loss defined the emotional structure of Ash's journey for over 2 decades. He came close so many times. He won regional tournaments eventually. He finally became world champion in 2023. In one of the most emotionally overwhelming moments in the show's long history, the culmination of a journey that began with losing to Richie in the Indigo League in 1998. Fact 56. The banned episode known as The Legend of Dratini was removed from international broadcast not because of anything specifically about Dratini, but because of the episode's extensive and direct depiction of firearms. In the episode, a Safari Zone warden and various other characters point guns directly at Ash and his companions at several points in the story. This content was deemed unacceptable for younger international audiences, and the episode was never dubbed into English. Its absence created a continuity gap for Western viewers. Several Pokémon that Ash supposedly caught during the Safari Zone visit appear in later episodes without any introduction because the capturing moments happened in the banned episode. International fans for years were left wondering where these Pokémon came from, the same way you sometimes arrive in the middle of a conversation that's already been going on without you. Fact 57. The Electric Soldier Porygon incident remains one of the most significant events in anime broadcasting history. On the 16th of December, 1997, episode 38 of the first season aired in Japan. About 20 minutes into the episode, Pikachu uses a thunderbolt attack on a series of virtual missiles, and the animators rendered the explosion using rapidly strobing red and blue lights, a technique meant to evoke the digital environment the characters were inhabiting. That 4-second sequence caused seizures in 685 children across Japan, who were hospitalized with varying degrees of symptoms. 2 remained in hospital for more than 2 weeks. Nintendo's share price dropped roughly 3.2% in the immediate aftermath. The anime went off the air for 4 months. Every existing and upcoming episode was re-edited to reduce strobing effects. Pokémon Shock, as the Japanese press called it, was never broadcast again anywhere in the world, in any form. Fact 58. Here is the quietly infuriating part of the Porygon story. Pikachu caused the seizures, not Porygon. Porygon was the episode's title character and did appear in it, but it had nothing to do with the strobing animation. Pikachu's attack caused the explosion. Pikachu's trainer ordered the attack. Pikachu executed it, but because the episode was called Electric Soldier Porygon, and because Porygon was the creature most visually associated with the episode in press coverage, Porygon effectively became the scapegoat for an incident it was not responsible for. Porygon and its evolutions, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, have appeared in the anime only in brief cameos since 1997. In 2020, the official Pokémon social media account posted simply that Porygon did nothing wrong. It's one of the stranger footnotes in entertainment history, a digital duck charged with a crime it didn't commit. Fact 59. Team Rocket's motto changes between countries and between different versions of the dubbing. The famous English motto, "Prepare for trouble and make it double," is known to a generation of Western fans with near-religious familiarity. But the Japanese motto is substantially different in tone and imagery, leaning into themes of love, honor, and wordplay rather than the more theatrical English version. Other international dubs localize the motto in their own ways, sometimes changing the imagery quite dramatically to suit cultural expectations. Team Rocket's motto is a capsule summary of how much creative latitude different localization teams had in interpreting the show's material for their specific audiences. Fact 60. Misty was originally considered as the potential protagonist of the anime. In early pitches to broadcasting networks, producers explored the idea of making the female companion the central trainer while Ash played a secondary role. TV executives reportedly pushed back on this, feeling that a male protagonist would have broader international commercial appeal. Despite that decision, Misty became one of the most beloved characters in the franchise's history. Her sharp personality, her passion for water-type Pokémon, and her complicated relationship with her siblings in Cerulean City all gave her a depth that supporting characters in similar shows rarely received. She left the show at the end of the Johto arc, and her absence was genuinely felt by an enormous portion of the audience. Fact 61. James from Team Rocket comes from an extremely wealthy family. This detail was established early in the anime and referenced occasionally throughout the series' flashbacks to his opulent childhood estate, his betrothed fiancée Jezebel, the almost grotesque excess of his former life that he abandoned for a life of low-level villainy and genuine friendship. Early scripts apparently intended this backstory to be a more recurring theme, that the central tension of James's character was between the privilege he was born into and the chaotic freedom he chose instead. The idea was only explored a handful of times in actual broadcast episodes, but it gave James a surprising interiority that elevated him above the simple comic relief he might otherwise have been. Fact 62. The Meowth who speaks human language in the anime, an ability unique among Pokémon in the show's world, learned to talk out of a desire to impress a Meowth named Meowsy who preferred human things. This origin story was given to Meowth in a flashback episode, and is both poignant and slightly absurd in the way that the best Pokémon storytelling tends to be. But the details of how Meowth's characterization developed in the Japanese original were significantly shaped by the voice actress Inuko Inuyama, who improvised elements of his vocal delivery to give him a streetwise, slightly weary quality that wasn't in the written scripts. That improvisational texture made Meowth so compelling that writers gave him progressively more screen time and more complex material. He was originally planned to leave Team Rocket in early story drafts. Fan response kept him permanently embedded in the group. Fact 63. Ash's Butterfree farewell episode. The episode where Ash releases his Butterfree to be with its mate, and the show's theme plays over a slow montage of every Pokémon battle, and gentle moment they shared was one of the first times the anime made large numbers of children cry. and it established an emotional template that the show returned to repeatedly. What very few people know is that the episode was originally written around Pidgeotto rather than Butterfree. The writers switched to Butterfree because it was more visually distinct and colorful, and because the purple Butterfree serving as the love interest could be designed to stand out clearly from Ash's orange one. That purple Butterfree was specifically designed to look different from normal coloration long before the concept of shiny Pokémon existed in the games. In a quiet way, that purple Butterfree was the anime's first shiny. Fact 64. The episode where Ash's Pidgeot stays behind in the Viridian Forest to protect a flock of Pidgey and Pidgeotto, with Ash promising to come back for it once the current crisis is resolved, is one of the longest-running open narrative threads in the show. Ash never came back. Pidgeot was never mentioned again in any substantive way. Whether the writers simply forgot or decided that leaving the promise unfulfilled was more true to the reality of how life works has never been clearly addressed. Fans have debated this for decades, some finding it poignant and others finding it deeply frustrating. It remains one of the most famous loose ends in the entire anime. Fact 65. Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket and Viridian City's gym leader, was at one point in development considered for a much larger role in the anime's ongoing storyline. Writers explored a narrative arc in which Giovanni personally targeted Ash, having him watched, having him hunted after the repeated failures of his field agents. This would have created a genuine personal antagonist for the hero, elevating the stakes of every Team Rocket encounter. The idea was ultimately dropped in favor of keeping Giovanni distant and shadowy, appearing rarely and maintaining the sense that he was far above the day-to-day chaos his subordinates created. The choice kept him intimidating in a way that regular appearances might have eroded, but the ghost of that more confrontational storyline occasionally surfaced in episodes that showed Giovanni watching footage of Team Rocket's failures with barely contained frustration. Section 5. Team Rocket, the villains who became the heart. In most children's adventure stories, the villains are simple. They exist to threaten, to be defeated, and to confirm the hero's growth. Team Rocket was different. Jessie, James, and Meowth were introduced as antagonists and became something the show's creators almost certainly did not fully anticipate. The emotional center of the anime for a generation of viewers who found them funnier, stranger, and more human than almost anyone else in the story. Fact 66. Team Rocket as an organization was directly inspired by organized crime syndicates and the way their presence gave certain films and novels a specific moral texture. Tajiri wanted a criminal organization in the game that felt genuinely threatening without being cartoonish, a group motivated by profit and power who treated Pokémon as tools and commodities. The game's encounter with them in the Rocket hideout beneath the Celadon City Game Corner, then the Sylph Co. takeover, and finally Giovanni at the top of his gym. This escalating confrontation with organized crime gave Pokémon Red and Blue a kind of narrative drive that was unusual for games aimed at younger players. The anime adapted Team Rocket in a very different direction, turning them into the source of most of the show's comedy, but the game's version of them maintained a genuine menace that fans still feel in the original titles. Fact 67. Jessie was at one point in development imagined as a gym leader. Concept notes from the anime's early production describe her as a poison-type specialist who abandoned her role after becoming obsessed with theft, a character whose gymnasium stood empty because its leader had chosen a criminal life. This backstory would have given her a structured arc and a clearer motivation. It was scrapped in favor of making her a comedic villain, but the traces of it remain embedded in her default team choices. She consistently uses Arbok, Wobbuffet, and Seviper across the anime's run, all Pokémon with poison or deceptive typings, the choices of someone who once had a specific elemental identity. Fact 68. The Team Rocket trio was meant to leave the show entirely at multiple points. Writers seriously discussed having them depart permanently at the end of the Indigo arc, then again when the story moved to Hoenn. Each time, the decision was reversed. The characters had become too central, not just as a recurring structural element that provided each episode with a consistent, dramatic shape, but as genuinely beloved presences in their own right. Kids who watched the show often felt more warmly toward Jessie, James, and Meowth than toward the rotating cast of one-episode trainers and rivals. The trio's dynamic, the ambition, the bickering, the loyalty beneath all the arguing, The moments of genuine tenderness toward the Pokémon they actually cared about gave them a texture that proved irreplaceable. Fact 69. James's relationship with his Pokémon was consistently depicted as more emotionally complex than his role as a comic villain would normally require. He named his coughing with an affectionate Japanese suffix in the original Japanese dialogue, calling it Dogus instead of just coughing, giving it a pet name the way you'd call someone by a nickname rather than their given name. This kind of nuance almost never survived localization. The English dub smoothed over these small details in favor of more accessible characterization. But in the original Japanese, James was consistently shown to be someone who genuinely loved his Pokémon, who felt real grief when he had to part with them, and whose criminal career was less about malice than about running from a life of privilege he found suffocating. Fact 70. The concept for a Team Rocket spin-off series was seriously developed. Pitches were written for a show following Jesse, James, and Meowth pursuing their own dreams after leaving Giovanni, a kind of road trip narrative, set in the same world as the main anime, but with a completely different tone and focus. The concept was shelved when it became clear that removing the trio from the main show to give them their own would leave a gap that no substitute characters could fill. They stayed as recurring antagonists. But the fact that spin-off documents existed at all says something about how beloved they had become by the early 2000s, so beloved that someone thought their story could sustain a show entirely on its own. Fact 71. Meowth is the only Pokémon in the anime's main cast who can speak human language, but the mechanics of why are actually addressed in a flashback episode. He learned by obsessively imitating human speech, driven by his desire to impress Meowsy, a Meowth who lived with a wealthy human and looked down on street Pokémon. He taught himself to walk upright and to talk, failed to impress the Meowth he loved, and joined Team Rocket out of a combination of loneliness and nowhere better to go. The story is played partly for comedy, but it contains the kind of pathos that shows up occasionally in children's animation and hits differently when you come back to it as an adult. Meowth spent enormous effort and sacrifice to change himself entirely for someone who didn't want him. He ended up in Team Rocket. Sometimes the most devoted efforts lead you somewhere unexpected. Fact 72. The interaction between Team Rocket and Ash across the anime's original run follows a pattern that has been analyzed as something almost ritualistic. Ash and company arrive somewhere new. Team Rocket follows. Team Rocket reveals themselves with the motto, "Battle happens. Team Rocket loses. They blast off." The repetition was, according to writers, entirely intentional, not laziness, but structure. Each episode needed a consistent shape that viewers could settle into, and Team Rocket's persistent, always failing pursuit provided that shape reliably. The writers admitted in various interviews that they kept the trio around precisely because their dynamic gave every episode a familiar architecture. They were, in narrative terms, the frame around the painting. Fact 73. Giovanni's silence in the anime, his tendency to observe rather than act, to issue cold instructions through underlings rather than confronting the heroes himself, was a conscious choice meant to preserve his menace. Every time the writers considered bringing him into direct conflict with Ash, they stepped back from it. Direct confrontation would have humanized him, given him a scale, put a ceiling on how threatening he could feel. By staying in the shadows, by appearing only in brief scenes of barely suppressed fury watching his agents fail, he remained something the show could expand toward indefinitely. He was always the horizon line, never close enough to touch. Fact 74. The Rocket executives who appear in later generations of the games, particularly in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which bring Team Rocket back for Johto's postgame, were developed as counterpoints to the animated trio. Archer, Ariana, Petrel, and Proton are colder, more pragmatic, more genuinely threatening than the cartoonish Jesse and James. Their presence in the games is brief but impactful, and they represent what Team Rocket might look like if you stripped away the comedy. The design team wanted players to feel the difference between the bumbling field agents they knew from the anime and the people those field agents technically worked for people who weren't amusing at all. Fact 75. Jessie's hair, the enormous white-tipped cylindrical structure she wears in the anime, is a design choice that was apparently both deliberate and practical. In early production sketches, her hair was considerably more modest, but the team decided that giving her a truly unreasonable hairstyle served several purposes. It made her visually distinct at any distance, it contributed to her air of theatrical vanity, and it matched James's own dramatic magenta style in creating a duo who looked like they were costume dressing for a performance of their own lives. Several animators have mentioned in interviews that Jessie's hair was one of the most technically challenging recurring elements to draw consistently across the show's long run. Section 6. Hoenn and the Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald Era. The third generation of Pokémon games, released in Japan in November 2002 and in North America the following year, represented a kind of rebirth for the franchise. Ruby and Sapphire introduced 135 new Pokémon, a brand new region, and a set of features that felt genuinely fresh secret bases, double battles, Pokémon contests, weather-based mechanics. They also, controversially, launched without backward compatibility with Gold and Silver, a decision that alienated a portion of the existing fanbase but forced new players to engage with Hoenn on its own terms. Fact 76. Ruby and Sapphire contained a hidden Pokémon called the Snowflake Shellos problem. The games have data slots for creatures that exist in no final form, 25 unused slots between the Johto and Hoenn Pokémon, carrying partial data that includes type assignments and ability references but no sprites or names. The ability attached to some of these slots is called Cacophony, a sound-based immunity that was removed from the final game and replaced entirely by the identical ability Soundproof. The presence of Cacophony data in final cartridges that ship to consumers is a small window into the final weeks of development, a period when decisions are made quickly and traces of abandoned ideas remain in the code simply because there isn't time to go back and clean everything up. Fact 77. 68 Pokémon were scrapped during Ruby and Sapphire's development. 68. This is a remarkable number. Nearly half the final roster of those games was cut before the game shipped. No sprites were preserved in the final cartridges for most of them, but the existence of those slots can be inferred from gaps in the internal numbering system. The Game Freak Terra leak of 2024 revealed additional details about some of these cut creatures, including developer notes on why specific designs were rejected. One scrapped creature received the terse evaluation. Looks deformed. Another fire-type canine design was rejected as being too similar to an existing Pokémon. The scale of the cutting process gives you some sense of how ambitious and how uncertain the third generation was in its early stages. Fact 78. The berry system in Ruby and Sapphire was tied to the Game Boy Advance's internal real-time clock in a way that created a very specific, slow-motion tragedy. Berries grew in real time, taking anywhere from hours to days to ripen. But the clock was powered by an internal battery inside the cartridge, and when that battery ran out, typically after about 5 to 10 years, the berries stopped growing forever. This happened to millions of cartridges in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and many players who returned to their childhood copies of Ruby or Sapphire found that their berry patches had become permanently barren. Nintendo acknowledged the problem and later added ways to reset time mechanics in subsequent games, but the original cartridges remained broken. The mechanic that was designed to reward patience players across real time eventually punished the most loyal ones, the ones who held onto their games for decades. Fact 79. Mirage Island, a secret location in Ruby and Sapphire that appeared only under extremely rare circumstances, is one of the most impenetrable mysteries in the franchise's history. The island appeared on the water southwest of Pacifidlog Town, but only on days when a specific number generated internally by the game matched a specific value in your party. The odds of this occurring on any given day were 1 in 65,535. Entire complete playthroughs went by without Mirage Island ever appearing. The NPC in Pacifidlog Town who mentioned it, an old man who told you whether or not the island was visible that day, was for most players a source of perpetual disappointment. The island contained the rare lychee berry and wild why-not when it did appear. Neither was important enough to justify the probability. Mirage Island existed primarily to be mysterious. Fact 80. The trick house in Route 110 was intended to be substantially larger and more elaborate than what shipped in the final game. Development notes reference it as a concept for a sprawling puzzle dungeon, multiple rooms with shifting traps, a resident roster of trainers who would fight you after each challenge, and new puzzle types unlocking as you progress through the main game's story. Hardware limitations on the Game Boy Advance forced significant compression of this ambition. What remained was charming and memorable in its own right, a quirky side attraction with a magician host who hid and redecorated between each of your visits. But the concept documents hint at something that could have rivaled the game's dungeon design. Fact 81. The story of Ruby and Sapphire originally contained significantly more direct environmental messaging than what shipped. The rivalry between Team Magma, who sought to expand the landmass, and Team Aqua, who sought to expand the sea, was built on themes about the human impact on the natural world, which is, in a different register, the same concern that originally motivated Tajiri to design a game about exploring and cataloging nature before it disappeared. The developers reportedly felt that making the environmental message too overt might read as politically charged, and they softened it. The remnants are still clearly there in the game's structure, two teams with opposing philosophies about how the world should be shaped, both causing ecological catastrophe in the name of their ideology. The theme survived, just less loudly. Fact 82. Wild double battles were coded into Ruby and Sapphire and removed before the games shipped. The data for them is still present. Encounter code that generates two wild Pokémon simultaneously, the way the trainer double battle system worked. The feature would have appeared in tall grass on certain routes. Why it was cut is unclear, possibly balance concerns, possibly performance concerns on the hardware, possibly a decision that the feature wasn't polished enough to ship. Double battles became a beloved and important part of the competitive scene and of later games' design. Knowing that the very first double encounter in the franchise was almost a wild battle, not a trainer battle, is one of those small details that quietly reframes how you think about the whole system. Fact 83. Pokémon Emerald introduced the Battle Frontier, one of the most ambitious post-game competitive systems in the series' history. 7 distinct facilities, each with their own rules and their own frontier brain at the top, each requiring a completely different strategic approach. The Brain Leaders were originally developed as concepts for extra Elite Four members in Diamond and Pearl, a planned expanded final challenge that was eventually scrapped for the 4th generation games. When the concept was redirected into the Battle Frontier, it evolved into something arguably more interesting. Not a linear escalation of challenge, but a set of lateral ones, each requiring a different kind of knowledge and preparation. Emerald's Battle Frontier remains one of the most discussed post-game systems in the franchise, consistently cited by competitive players as the high-water mark of what those systems can be. Fact 84. The Pokémon Colosseum games, released on the GameCube alongside the mainline handheld titles, were originally designed around a considerably more permissive snag mechanic. In the final games, players can only snag shadow Pokémon creatures that have been artificially corrupted and are being used as fighting machines by the villainous organization. The original design allowed players to snag any trainer's Pokémon regardless of whether it was a shadow type. Beta testers found this made the game chaotic and unbalancing, stripping away the moral structure that made the shadow mechanic meaningful. The decision to restrict snagging to shadow Pokémon only was thus a narrative decision as much as a design one. It preserved the ethical weight of what the player character was doing. You weren't stealing. You were rescuing. Fact 85. Wes, the protagonist of Pokémon Colosseum, is one of the only playable characters in the franchise's history to begin the game with strong, already evolved Pokémon rather than low-level starters. He opens with an Espeon and an Umbreon. This was entirely deliberate. The development team wanted Colosseum to feel more mature, more grounded in the idea of an experienced trainer rather than a child beginning a journey. The whole game was designed at a different register than the handheld titles. Darker environments, a criminal organization presented more menacingly, a backstory involving betrayal and escape. Giving Wes a team he had clearly built over time before the game even started set the tone for everything that followed. Section 7. Sinnoh's Mysteries Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. The 4th generation of Pokémon games arrived in Japan in 2006 and reached North America and Europe in 2007. Diamond and Pearl introduced 107 new Pokémon, dramatically expanded the franchise's mythology with the revelation of Arceus and the creation mythology of the Pokémon universe, and brought the series to the Nintendo DS, a platform with dual screens, wireless connectivity, and an online infrastructure that transformed how players interacted with each other across the globe. Fact 86. Arceus, the being described in the Sinnoh mythology as the god who shaped the universe, who emerged from an egg before there was anything else, who created the world with its 1,000 arms, was not given a proper in-game event for players to encounter until many years after Diamond and Pearl shipped. The game contained all the data for an Arceus encounter, including a cinematic event that would trigger when you obtained the Azure Flute item, but the Azure Flute was never officially distributed through Nintendo events. Players waited years for it. Some fan communities organized unofficial distributions. The Azure Flute's existence in the game's code was discovered by data miners and became one of the most famous pieces of unfinished content in the series. An entire event scripted and ready to run, attached to an item that was never given out. Fact 87. The underground in Diamond and Pearl, the multiplayer zone where players could dig for fossils and items, build secret bases, and play capture-the-flag-style minigames, contained an unused mechanic that would have allowed players to bury items for other players to find later. A kind of asynchronous scavenger hunt, embedded in the digging system. Balance concerns around rare items being freely distributed apparently killed the mechanic before launch. The spirit of it was revived years later in the remakes Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, where the underground's digging mechanic was significantly expanded. The original idea had simply been waiting for a version of the game that could implement it thoughtfully. Fact 88. Spiritomb, the ghost dark Pokémon with no weaknesses in its original form, required one of the most elaborate and socially demanding unlock processes in the franchise's history. To obtain it, players had to speak to 32 different players while in the underground, an act requiring either a large group of friends with the game or access to a public wireless event. This was nearly impossible for most players who didn't know many people who owned Diamond or Pearl. The method was so obscure and difficult that guides compared it to old playground rumors about impossible unlock conditions. Spiritomb's rarity became a kind of social status if you had one. You had either a lot of Pokémon playing friends or significant dedication. Fact 89. Diamond and Pearl's early development contained a very different villain organization. The final Team Galactic, obsessed with warping space and time to create a universe remade in Cyrus's image, grew out of an earlier concept for a group of eco-terrorists focused on exploiting Sinnoh's natural resources through mining and extraction. The thematic remnants of that original concept are still visible in the final games. Team Galactic uses mining equipment, and their headquarters includes industrial machinery and references to the land being reshaped. The pivot from environmental exploitation to cosmological nihilism was a significant escalation of ambition, giving the fourth generation its most philosophically complex villain in the history of the series to that point. Fact 90. Cyrus, Team Galactic's leader, is one of the most psychologically unusual antagonists in the franchise, a man who has decided that emotion and connection are weaknesses, who wants to unmake the universe and rebuild it without the spirit that animates relationships between people and Pokémon. His arc explores what the series' core values look like when taken to their logical opposite. If the games are fundamentally about bonds of friendship and partnership, then Cyrus is the character who has concluded that those bonds are the source of all suffering. He's not wrong in the way cartoonish villains are wrong. His reasoning is internally consistent. He's simply made a choice that the games propose is the most tragic choice a person can make. Fact 91. The Pokétch, the watch-like device introduced in Diamond and Pearl with numerous mini-apps, contained data for an alarm clock application that was never included in the final game. Data miners found it in the cartridge code. The app would have allowed players to set a real-world alarm that triggered a Pokémon sound when the time arrived. The feature was likely removed because leaving a DS running as an alarm clock would have drained the battery in ways that could frustrate players. The concept was charming, the idea of being woken up by your Pokémon, your virtual partner giving you a reason to get out of bed, and its removal left a small gap in the device's catalog of whimsical utilities. Fact 92. Platinum, the third version of the Sinnoh generation, introduced significant story additions, including the Distortion World, a surreal, gravity-defying dimensional space where Giratina was confined. The Distortion World is one of the most visually striking environments in the franchise, built on the idea of a space where the laws of physics don't apply consistently. Platforms float at any angle, waterfalls flow sideways, walking one direction might bring you out somewhere else entirely. Data miners found evidence in Platinum's code of a more elaborate distortion world that was compressed for the final game, additional rooms, additional puzzle sections, additional story content that was cut presumably for time. The version that shipped was already remarkable. The evidence of what was cut makes you wonder what it could have been. Fact 93. In Veilstone City in Platinum, there is a single NPC who describes seeing a giant pink Pokémon flying in the sky. Nothing in the game confirms what Pokémon this was. No event tied to it was ever distributed. The NPC remains in the city offering this cryptic description and nothing else. Fan speculation over the years has proposed everything from a Mew sighting to a Shaman event that was cut during development. The official guidebooks make no reference to the NPC having any gameplay significance. It's possible the dialogue was flavor text meant to add ambient mystery to Sinnoh's world. It's also possible it was a placeholder for an event that was never finished. Either way, the pink Pokémon in the sky is one of Sinnoh's most pleasant, unresolved puzzles. Section 8, Black, White, and the Moral Complexity Era. Pokémon Black and White, released in Japan in September 2010 and internationally in 2011, were widely described at the time of their release as the most narratively ambitious games in the series. They introduced 156 new Pokémon, banned all returning creatures from appearing until after the main story was complete, and placed the ethical framework of Pokémon training itself under active scrutiny through the character of N and the ideology of Team Plasma. Fact 94. N, the mysterious young man who serves simultaneously as rival, antagonist, and unlikely ally, was built around an argument that the games genuinely took seriously, that keeping Pokémon in battle and in Pokéballs was a form of exploitation. N was raised by Team Plasma's leader, Getsus, to believe this absolutely, having spent his childhood surrounded only by Pokémon who had been mistreated and who expressed their pain to him because N could understand Pokémon speech in a way other characters couldn't. The argument was designed to be compelling. Early drafts of the script made it even more so. Some gym leaders were shown agreeing with N's positions, questioning the morality of their own roles. This was significantly toned down before release, because it made the game's narrative resolution harder to achieve. But the remnants of that more genuinely ambiguous moral structure are still present in the texture of the final story. Fact 95. The season's mechanic in Black and White, where the game's world changed its appearance, and Pokémon availability based on the real-world month was originally planned to be more dramatically interactive. Unused dialogue in the game's data suggests that some seasonal events were going to include random severe weather, snowstorms that blocked access to certain routes, sandstorms that reduced visibility across entire outdoor areas. These effects would have been region-wide and would have occurred unpredictably rather than being tied to fixed calendar dates. The ambition was apparently too complex to implement cleanly on the DS hardware, and the seasonal system shipped as primarily a visual and encounter table change, rather than an active mechanical one. Fact 96. The Unova region was specifically designed around New York City, with Route 4's desert referencing the Mojave, the urban density of Castelia City evoking Lower Manhattan, and the highway infrastructure of the connecting routes capturing something of the elevated expressways that define the city's skyline. Game director Junichi Masuda spent time in New York City during the game's development to absorb the atmosphere. The decision to set a Pokémon game in something recognizable as an American urban environment was deliberate and significant. It marked the franchise's first explicit departure from the pastoral Japanese countryside aesthetic that had defined every previous region. Fact 97. Pokémon Black and White had gyms that were designed to change based on the time of day, different trainers, different puzzles, different atmospheric details depending on whether you arrived in the morning, afternoon, or evening. The concept was scrapped during development, reportedly because balancing 3 distinct versions of each gym was simply too resource-intensive given the game's already ambitious scope. The idea eventually found partial expression in Pokémon Sword and Shield's version-exclusive gyms, which achieved a similar effect of making the same game feel differently structured depending on which version you owned. Fact 98. The Yamask Pokédex entry in Black and White describes the creature's mask as the face it wore when it was a human. Yamask is stated to carry the mask, the face of its former self, and to sometimes gaze at it and weep from the weight of its memories. This was one of the first genuinely unsettling Pokédex entries that mainstream players encountered, partly because it was delivered with no dramatic framing. It appeared in the same interface as entries about electricity storage and wing composition, just quietly describing a creature that used to be a person and now carries the memory of that former existence as a mask it holds up to weep over. Players who were not expecting existential horror from their creature-collecting game found it genuinely affecting. Fact 99. X and Y, released in 2013 as the first mainline Pokémon games on the Nintendo 3DS, introduced Mega Evolution, a temporary transformation that powered certain Pokémon up during battle. What almost everyone missed at the time was that Mega Evolution was originally designed as a permanent change rather than a reversible one. Early concept art and development documents show mega forms being treated as true evolutionary endpoints, transformations that happened once and stayed. The developers eventually concluded that permanent mega evolution would be unbalancing in ways that couldn't be easily corrected, and the mechanic was redesigned as a temporary burst triggered during battle. The switch from permanent to temporary also dramatically changed the narrative meaning of the mechanic. Instead of a Pokémon transcending itself, it became a Pokémon choosing to push beyond its limits for a moment, then returning. Fact 100. AZ, the ancient king who appears in X and Y as a supporting character with a backstory spanning 3,000 years, owns a floette, specifically a variant called Eternal Flower Floette, that was described in the game's dialogue as something that could be obtained by players in the future. An NPC explicitly hints at this. Players waited years. An event distribution for Eternal Flower Floette was prepared by the Pokémon Company and fully coded into the game. The data for it exists in X and Y's cartridges. It was never released. As of the time of this script's writing, Eternal Flower Floette remains one of the most infamous pieces of unreleased Pokémon content in the franchise's history. A ghost Pokémon in the truest sense, present in the code, absent from reality. Section 9. Sun, Moon, Sword, Shield, and the modern era. The 7th and 8th generations of Pokémon games Sun and Moon on the 3DS, Sword and Shield on the Nintendo Switch brought the franchise through some of its most dramatic design evolutions and most passionate community debates. New mechanics, controversial design decisions, and the slow building of full open-world play all took shape across these games and their successors. Fact 101. Sun and Moon were set in the Alola region, a fictionalized version of Hawaii, complete with tropical environments, surfing culture, and a community of characters that felt more warmly drawn than almost any previous region's cast. The games replaced gym battles with island trials challenges that tested player knowledge and skill in formats other than straight Pokémon battles. This was the first fundamental redesign of the gym structure since the original games, and it produced a set of sequences, including the Totem Pokémon battles, that many players consider among the most memorable encounters in the franchise. Fact 102. Sun and Moon contained unused dialogue in the game files, where Lucamine, the game's antagonist, explicitly referred to the Ultra Beasts by individual names in a way that treated them as singular entities, unique individuals, rather than species. In the shipped game, multiple Ultra Beasts of each type can be caught, making them feel more like exotic Pokémon species than one-of-a-kind godlike visitors. The unused dialogue's implication that each Ultra Beast was a specific, irreplaceable individual would have dramatically changed the moral texture of catching them. It would also have been narratively interesting. Is capturing a one-of-a-kind alien visitor with its own identity the same as catching a wild creature? Fact 103. Poképelago in Sun and Moon, the series of islands where your stored Pokémon could relax, find items, and level up passively, had a planned feature called Adventure Islands that was cut before the game shipped. On these islands, groups of your stored Pokémon would have embarked on short, text-based adventures of their own, exploring caves, forests, and beaches and stories told from their perspective, with outcomes that would have been reflected in items or experience they brought back. The mechanic would have been one of the first times the games depicted Pokémon having agency and experience independent of their trainers. The remnants of the code are in the final game's data. The islands are just not accessible through normal play. Fact 104. Sword and Shield's wild area was described by the development team as the realization of a design aspiration that had existed in the studio since at least Generation 3. The concept of open-world Pokémon exploration, moving freely through a large environment, encountering Pokémon in real time, rather than through random encounters in defined grass patches, had been discussed and shelved. Multiple times because the hardware couldn't support it, the Nintendo Switch finally gave Game Freak enough processing and rendering capability to build something that approximated the vision. The wild area was a foundation. Legends. Arceus and Scarlet and Violet built the full cathedral on that foundation, eventually delivering the open-world experience that the franchise had been moving toward for nearly 2 decades. Fact 105. Pokémon Sword and Shield contain unused animations for overworld Pokémon interactions that were never activated in the base game. Specific Pokémon had movement sequences, suggesting they could follow the player character or chase objects through the wild area. These animations were discovered in the game's files by data miners before the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra DLC packages were released. They were interpreted, correctly as it turned out, as preparation for the return of the following Pokémon mechanic that the DLC eventually restored. Game Freak was apparently working on that feature before the base game shipped, but wasn't able to get it into the initial release. Fact 106. The camping feature in Sword and Shield, where players could interact with their Pokémon team and cook curry, contained hidden reaction animations for specific species that triggered only once every several hundred encounters. Certain Pokémon had animations that appeared when you presented them with specific curry types reactions that included them refusing to eat, playfully stealing food from other Pokémon, or performing elaborate expressions of delight. These were designed as rewards for players who spent extended time in camp, details that most players would never see even in a complete playthrough. The existence of this kind of deep, practically invisible detail is a reminder that game developers often put far more into their work than any reasonable person would ever discover. Section 10. The trading card game's strange and wonderful history. The Pokémon trading card game launched in Japan in October 1996, just 8 months after the original games. By the time Wizards of the Coast brought it to North America in January 1999, the franchise had already established itself as a cultural phenomenon, and the cards became one of the most successful, collectible card games in history, outselling even Magic, the Gathering in several markets during the height of the craze. Fact 107. The base set launched in Japan in October 1996, with just 102 cards. Creatures Inc., the company behind the card game, drew on Ken Sugimori's original artwork and brought in additional artists including Mitsuhiro Arita and Keiji Kinabuchi. The cards were immediately successful in Japan, moving from hobby gaming circles into mainstream convenience stores and toy retailers within months. The quality control of the original Japanese print run was meticulous. The same could not always be said of what followed. Fact 108. When Wizards of the Coast took over English-language distribution in 1998 and launched the base set internationally in January 1999, they inherited both a phenomenon and a manufacturing challenge. The demand for Pokémon cards in 1999 was simply staggering, far beyond what anyone had planned for. Print runs were doubled, tripled, extended. Quality control suffered under the pressure. The English base set ended up with multiple distinct print variations. The first print, now called the Shadowless Edition, because the Pokémon art frames lack the drop shadow that later prints included, is significantly more valuable to collectors today. A first edition Shadowless Charizard in near mint condition has sold at auction for figures well into 6 figures. This is a piece of cardboard that was printed in 1999. Fact 109. The pre-release Raichu card is one of the most contentious artifacts in Pokémon card collecting history. During the early Wizards of the Coast era, a stamp reading pre-release was applied to certain promotional cards before release events. The kind of stamp that signified a card was from a pre-launch testing run. One of these stamps was allegedly applied to a Raichu card rather than the intended promotional Pokémon. Only a tiny number of collectors have claimed to own one. Wizards of the Coast gave conflicting statements about its existence over the years. Some experts have authenticated examples. Others have raised questions about their legitimacy. The card exists in a permanent state of uncertainty, possibly the rarest Pokémon card in the world, possibly a sophisticated fabrication, possibly something in between. Fact 110. The shadowless base set cards have a quirk beyond the drop shadow. The first print also contained different artwork positioning and color saturation compared to later prints. The famous first edition stamp, a small circle with the number 1 inside it, printed on the left side of the card's center, distinguishes the very first printing from all subsequent unlimited editions. These stamps were applied to first edition cards for only the first print run of each set. Once the initial print was sold through, subsequent unlimited editions omitted the stamp. Collectors distinguish between first edition, shadowless unlimited, and standard unlimited as 3 distinct variations of the base set, each with different valuations in the current market. Fact 111. The Slowking Pokémon Power on its first edition Neo Genesis card became one of the most notorious game-breaking misprints in the game's history. Due to a translation error, Slowking's power allowed players to stack multiple copies of the card on the bench and use the combined effect to lock their opponent completely out of using trainer cards, as long as those Slowkings were in play. The intent of the card in the original Japanese version was considerably less oppressive. The mistranslated English version created a lockdown strategy so powerful, it was eventually addressed through official rulings in tournament play. Wizards of the Coast received significant criticism for their quality control on translation during this period. Fact 112. The Ancient Mew promotional card, distributed at movie theaters in North America and Europe during the 2000 release of Pokémon the Movie 2000, was printed in a script resembling ancient runes or hieroglyphs, a stylized design meant to evoke the mystery of Mew's legendary status. Most players assumed the card was purely decorative and ceremonial, but the text could be translated. In certain older tournament formats, the card created unbalanced strategies that officials hadn't anticipated when the decision was made to distribute it. The Ancient Mew was eventually banned from official tournament play. A card that most people had been using as a display piece turned out to be powerful enough to require formal prohibition. Fact 113. An urban legend spread through the Pokémon card community in the late 1990s that psychic-type cards were cursed. The reasoning was never exactly clear. Some kids claimed the purple color was bad luck. Others said specific cards brought misfortune. Others connected it to the dark Pokédex lore around psychic types in the games. The rumor became widespread enough that some children genuinely refused to include psychic-type cards in their decks out of superstition. Wizards of the Coast apparently felt compelled to release statements addressing the rumor, which is both a remarkable thing for a game company to have to do and a perfect illustration of how mythology forms organically around objects that children invest with deep meaning. Fact 114. The transition from Wizards of the Coast to the Pokémon Company International as the English-language publisher of the trading card game in 2003 was not entirely smooth. When Wizards lost the license, they were reportedly preparing an entirely new expansion set called Jamboree that was never printed. After the license transferred, Wizards of the Coast sued Nintendo, claiming that insider secrets had been stolen. Both parties settled outside of court in December of 2003. The details of the settlement were not made public. The Jamboree set that was never released remains an interesting what-if for card historians, a collection of designs that were completed and ready to print, then simply stopped. Fact 115. The card artwork itself has become one of the most distinctive and collectible forms of Pokémon art. Certain illustrators Mitsuhiro Arita, Ken Sugimori, Koki Saito, and later artists working in completely different styles have each left distinctive visual signatures on the cards they created. The Neo Genesis Espeon, illustrated by Naoyo Kimura, with its soft pastel light and atmospheric depth, is considered by many collectors to be one of the most beautiful pieces of art in the game's history. As the card game has evolved across 30 years, its art has ranged from watercolor naturalism to surrealist painting to photography to abstract digital work, making the physical cards a kind of ongoing anthology of illustration styles. Section 11. Spin-offs, Snap, Stadium, and Mystery Dungeon. Beyond the mainline games and the anime, Pokémon has produced dozens of spin-off titles across multiple genres, many of them deeply strange and unexpectedly beautiful. Stadium and its successor gave players their first look at Pokémon in 3 dimensions. Snap turned the franchise into a nature photography game. Mystery Dungeon put players inside the Pokémon's perspective. Each of these titles contains its own deep library of secrets. Fact 116. Pokémon Stadium on the Nintendo 64 began not as a game at all, but as an internal tool. The Game Freak and HAL Laboratory teams were building three-dimensional models of the Kanto Pokémon to help visualize how they would look and move outside of the Game Boy's tiny screen, and they created a basic battle interface for testing those models. When someone realized how exciting it was to watch fully animated three-dimensional Pokémon battle each other, the project expanded into a standalone title. The game was born from experimentation and the simple joy of watching something you loved rendered in a new way. Its identity is more showcase than adventure. It has no real story, no world to explore, just a series of increasingly challenging battle facilities directly reflects its origins as a visualization tool. Fact 117. Stadium contained a set of rental Pokémon that players could borrow if they didn't have their own Game Boy teams. These rentals were intentionally weaker than properly trained Pokémon. Developers wanted to incentivize players to transfer their own teams from the Game Boy games rather than simply relying on the defaults. But in Stadium 2, the rental Pokémon's movesets were actually designed around real competitive strategies of the time. The developers researched what moves actual players were using in tournaments and incorporated those moves into the rental teams, creating a situation where players who didn't know competitive strategy were being quietly educated through the rental system without realizing it. Fact 118. Stadium contained a reference in its internal code to an unused minigame featuring Hitmonchan breaking boards, a martial arts challenge that was apparently planned but cut before release. The game shipped with minigames, including the famous Clefairy Says Memory Challenge, Ekans Hoop Hurl, and the Magikarp Splash Jumping Contest. The Hitmonchan board-breaking game would have fit naturally alongside these, and its absence is one of the more tantalizing missing pieces of the Stadium experience. The code reference is too fragmentary to fully reconstruct what the minigame would have looked like or played like. Fact 119. Pokémon Snap on the Nintendo 64 is a game about photographing wild Pokémon in their natural environments, riding a pre-programmed rail car through environments, and taking pictures that are evaluated for composition, expression, and the presence of special behaviors. It was developed by HAL Laboratory and published in 1999, and it captured something about the pleasure of wildlife observation that the main games gestured toward but never fully explored. HAL wanted the game to feel connected to the broader Pokémon media landscape of the time, and certain photographs, particularly a shot of Mew in the final level, surrounded by an orb effect, were deliberately designed to echo promotional artwork from the first film. Fact 120. Pokémon Snap contained unused code for a riding mechanic that would have allowed players to climb onto Lapras's back to approach water-based Pokémon from closer range. The idea was that certain shots would only be achievable from the water's surface rather than from the rail car's fixed elevation. Data miners discovered the leftover programming years after the game's release. The developers have confirmed in various interviews that Snap's original design was considerably more ambitious than what shipped a more dynamic and interactive photography experience that had to be compressed to meet the game's deadline. The idea of riding a Lapras through these environments and photographing creatures at water level would have been genuinely beautiful, and its absence remains one of the game's more poignant almosts. Fact 121. New Pokémon Snap, released in 2021 for the Nintendo Switch, finally restored many of the ambitions the original game couldn't achieve. Players gained the ability to throw items, play music, use a zoom lens, and find different Pokémon behaviors through experimentation. The camera could be repositioned somewhat freely. Multiple routes through each environment existed. The idea of a richer, more player-driven photography experience that had been sitting in HAL Laboratory's notes since 1999 was finally realized across 22 years of waiting. Fact 122. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series games, where the player becomes a Pokémon themselves and forms rescue teams with other Pokémon, is one of the franchise's most unexpectedly emotionally powerful branches. Developed by Chunsoft rather than Game Freak, the games told stories about identity, memory, sacrifice, and the nature of belonging that were far more emotionally complex than anything the mainline series attempted at equivalent points in the franchise's development. The original scripts for Blue and Red Rescue Team were reportedly even darker than what shipped storylines, involving permanent death for Pokémon who failed certain missions, rather than the defeated and rescued mechanic that appeared in the final games. These darker drafts were softened for the younger audience the games were aimed at, but the emotional weight that survived that softening was still enough to make grown adults cry. Fact 123. Pokémon Go, the augmented reality mobile game that became a global phenomenon in the summer of 2016, had trading capability coded into its earliest versions. The feature wasn't ready at launch and was cut from the initial release, but data miners found menus and code referencing trading mechanics in the very first versions of the app. This means trading was part of the game's fundamental design from the beginning. It just took 2 years for the implementation to be stable enough to actually launch. Trading was finally introduced to Pokémon Go in 2018. Fact 124. Pokémon Go had a planned mechanic where wild Pokémon would flee into real-world locations when players missed catches, forcing physical pursuit. The development team built it, tested it, and then removed it because of serious safety concerns. The obvious nightmare scenario of children running into streets, chasing a fleeing virtual creature on their phones. The decision to remove the fleeing mechanic was thus less a design choice and more a child safety decision. The simpler mechanic of a Pokémon simply disappearing from the screen was much less exciting, but it was also much less likely to result in someone running into traffic. Section 12. Design Secrets, Mythologies, and the Living World. Throughout the franchise's history, the creatures at the center of it have drawn from an extraordinary range of inspirations: world mythology, folklore, regional legends, real animals, everyday objects, abstract concepts, and occasionally just pure visual whimsy. The connections between Pokémon and their source material are sometimes obvious, sometimes buried, and sometimes disputed, the subject of fan theories that have run for decades without resolution. Fact 125. Gyarados is based on a legend from Chinese and Japanese folklore about a carp that swims upstream against a powerful current and leaps over a waterfall called the Dragon Gate, transforming into a dragon as a reward for its perseverance. The legend is called the Koi's Ascension, and it serves as a metaphor for achievement through sustained effort. The idea that something which appears useless or weak can become extraordinary if it persists long enough. The connection between this myth and Magikarp evolving into Gyarados is the most direct mythological parallel in the franchise, a complete narrative arc compressed into a single evolutionary line. Fact 126. Ninetales, the golden nine-tailed fox Pokémon, draws from the Kitsune mythology of Japan, the supernatural foxes who accumulate tails as they grow older and more powerful, eventually becoming beings of immense spiritual significance. The Pokédex entry for Ninetales in Fire Red states that according to legend, it can live for 1,000 years, and that each of its tails is imbued with a supernatural power. It warns that grabbing one of Ninetales' tails will result in a 1,000-year curse. The Kitsune connection is so direct that it's essentially the game confirming a cultural reference rather than obscuring one. Fact 127. Cubone's design is built around one of the most deliberately sorrowful concepts in the franchise. Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother on its head as a helmet, and it cries alone at night for the parent it has lost. Early concept art for Cubone showed multiple different skull designs, varying shapes that implied different possible species of mothers, a detail that would have made each individual Cubone's tragedy uniquely specific. That concept was abandoned in favor of a single design, but its existence in the early sketches implies that the original vision of Cubone's lore was even darker than what shipped. Every Cubone carrying a different reminder of a specifically personal loss, each one shaped by the exact creature it once had, and no longer does. Fact 128. The Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan names in English refer to Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, two martial arts legends who were prominent in Western popular culture. This substitution happened entirely in the localization process. The original Japanese names reference different figures. Hitmonchan is called Ebiwalar in Japanese, after Japanese boxer Hiroyuki Ebihara. Hitmonlee is called Sawamuler, after martial artist Tadashi Sawamura. The English localization team made a judgment call that Lee and Chan would be more recognizable to Western audiences, and they were right. But it meant that the Japanese cultural references embedded in the original names, the specific nods to Japanese athletic heroes, were completely replaced by different references that served the same function in a different cultural context. Fact 129. Jinx's original design, featuring dark skin and exaggerated features, became a significant controversy in the early 2000s when a critic pointed out the resemblance to racist caricatures. Game Freak responded by changing Jinx's skin color from black to purple in all subsequent game releases and anime appearances. Old episodes of the anime featuring Jinx were re-edited for later distributions, with the character's coloring changed to purple. This means that different physical copies and digital versions of certain episodes contain different versions of the character. Some people have seen a purple Jinx their entire lives, while others watch the unedited episodes as children and remember the original design. The controversy around Jinx was one of the first times Nintendo and Game Freak publicly altered a Pokémon design in response to cultural criticism. Fact 130. The Drifloon Pokédex entry in Diamond and Pearl describes it as a balloon-like Pokémon that grabs children's hands and attempts to drag them away. The entry, which appears in the same factual tone as every other Pokédex description, managed to genuinely disturb younger players in a way that other dark entries hadn't, partly because it describes something so specific and predatory. Drifloon wasn't dangerous or powerful in battle. It was a small, round, vaguely cheerful-looking creature with strings attached. The gap between its appearance and what the game quietly claimed it was doing created an unsettling dissonance. Fact 131. The Gengar line has an interesting relationship with the Clefable line that has generated persistent fan theorizing. Their silhouettes are very similar. Both are purple or pink, roughly humanoid in shape, with similar proportions. One fan theory proposes that Gengar is the ghost of a Clefable, that when a Clefable dies, it becomes a Gengar. This has never been confirmed by Game Freak, and the visual similarity may simply be a design coincidence. But the theory is memorable and structurally elegant. Clefable as the innocent, friendly, moon-connected creature it appears to be, and Gengar as what that same form becomes in death. The idea that the cute and the sinister exist as mirror images of each other fits the Pokémon universe's habit of pairing light with shadow. Fact 132. The Unown, the alphabet-shaped Pokémon found in the ruins of Alph and later in similar archaeological sites across multiple regions, have development notes indicating that early gold and silver planning included punctuation mark Unown exclamation points, question marks, and other symbols that would have significantly expanded the gimmick. Placeholder sprites for some of these were found in early data. In the final Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes, the punctuation Unown did appear exclamation, and question mark variants were officially added. It took over a decade, but the scrapped design concept eventually made it into a game. Fact 133. Arceus, the god Pokémon introduced in Diamond and Pearl, is designed around the concept of a blank slate, a creator who predates everything and from whom everything descends. Its normal typing reflects this emptiness at the origin of the universe. It becomes any type when holding the corresponding plate item. The number 120 means nothing accidentally in Pokémon design. Arceus has 120 distinct known forms, one for each element recognized in the ancient Sinnoan religion. The mythology built around Arceus in the games draws from multiple religious traditions, simultaneously creation ex nihilo, the idea of divine plates as sacred texts, the cosmogony split into gods of time, space, and antimatter. Fact 134. The Pokémon Adventures manga, which ran parallel to the games and anime from the beginning, depicted a significantly darker and more violent world than the animated series. Characters received real injuries. Pokémon died on screen. A villain was depicted using a scyther to slice a gym leader in half. This was permitted because the manga targeted an older demographic than the Saturday morning cartoon, and because in Japan the line between children's and adult entertainment was drawn differently than in Western markets. The manga used its freedom to explore the implications of a world where people controlled powerful creatures, capable of mass destruction, going to places the anime would never go. Fact 135. The concept of Pokémon fusion combining creatures to create hybrid designs was developed and considered for inclusion in an early mainline game before being abandoned. Game Freak concluded that allowing player-created hybrids would undermine the individuality and distinctiveness of each species, which they felt was central to the series' appeal. The concept was fully dropped from mainline consideration. It has since appeared in numerous fan games and fan-made tools, becoming one of the most popular creative exercises in the community. The official Pokémon company has never revisited it, but its absence from the official games makes everything from Necrozma's fusions to Calorex's bonding mechanic feel like they're circling the concept without directly implementing it. Fact 136. Ken Sugimori's artistic style for the Pokémon designs went through a significant evolution across the franchise's history. The earliest Generation 1 designs were drawn in a naturalistic watercolor style that gave even fantastical creatures like Charizard a quality of physical weight. You could believe they occupied space and had real mass. Over time, as the team expanded and design responsibilities were distributed among many artists, the visual vocabulary of Pokémon became more varied, more anime-influenced in some generations, more abstract in others, more cartoonish, or more surrealist depending on the artist. Sugimori himself has acknowledged that maintaining visual consistency across hundreds of designers working across decades is one of the ongoing creative challenges of the franchise. Fact 137. Deoxys, the DNA Pokémon introduced in Ruby and Sapphire, was the franchise's first Pokémon explicitly described as an extraterrestrial, a virus from space that mutated upon exposure to a laser beam. Its ability to shift between four dramatically different forms, normal, attack, defense, and speed, was a design concept unique in the franchise. A Pokémon whose entire identity was defined by transformation and adaptability rather than a fixed nature. The concept reflected something that would become increasingly important in later generations: the idea of Pokémon whose design was built around a mechanical function rather than simply an aesthetic identity. Fact 138. Mega Evolution, introduced in X and Y, was designed partly in response to what the development team saw as a plateau in the emotional impact of the base evolution mechanic. Evolution in the original games was designed as a thrilling transformation, watching your small companion grow into something powerful and new. By the 6th generation, with over 600 Pokémon in the franchise, players had become somewhat desensitized to the evolution animation. Mega Evolution was an attempt to recapture that sense of transformation, but in a context where it felt dramatic and chosen activated during battle at a moment of crisis, visible to both players, potentially decisive. The spectacle of the Mega Evolution animation was designed to feel like something significant was happening, because something was. Fact 139. The design of legendary Pokémon across the generations has drawn from a remarkable range of mythological sources. The 3 legendary birds of Kanto are based on elemental deities from Aztec and Native American traditions. The legendary beasts of Johto, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune are resurrected versions of unnamed Pokémon who died in the Brass Tower fire, given new forms by Ho-Oh. Latios and Latios were designed to evoke the stealth aircraft aesthetic, with swept-back forms and aerodynamic precision. Groudon and Kyogre draw from the primordial battle between land and sea in various Pacific creation myths. The franchise has essentially built a world religion from elements of dozens of actual world religions, assembled into something that feels coherent and internally consistent. Fact 140. The Pokémon Snap Hole in later games is a recurring architectural joke, the windows and holes in walls, through which Pokémon peer in the original Snap, often appear in locations that shouldn't logically contain them. The Safari Zone building in Fire Red and Leaf Green has a window that looks out onto nothing. Certain Pokémon centers have spaces in their architecture that seem designed for a creature to be watched but where no creature appears. These may be unintentional, or they may be the design team's private joke about the visual language established by Snap and carried forward as an aesthetic habit. Section 13. The Pokédex, the Dark Lore, and what lies beneath. The Pokédex, the franchise's in-game encyclopedia of creatures, contains multitudes. Written from the perspective of various researchers, it presents itself as a database of scientific observation. Across nearly 900 entries, it has also become one of gaming's great repositories of quiet horror, describing creature behaviors, dietary habits, and physical properties in calm, factual language that occasionally reveals something deeply unsettling about the world these characters inhabit. Fact 141. Haunter's Pokédex entry in the original Red and Blue states that it can slip through any material, even brick walls, and that its touch causes a shiver that will eventually lead to death. This was one of the first entries to be explicitly threatening rather than simply descriptive. It presented Haunter not as a spooky mascot but as a genuinely dangerous entity, something that could walk through walls to reach you, and whose touch was gradually, quietly lethal. Players who were children at the time absorbed this information and generally responded by wanting a Haunter immediately. Fact 142. Kadabra's Pokédex entries have suggested, across multiple generations, that Kadabra was once a human child who fell asleep one night and woke up transformed. The entries are careful with their phrasing. They say this is what people believe, or what legend has it, but the suggestion is persistent and deliberate. Kadabra also carries a spoon it apparently had with it at the time of transformation. The concept of humans and Pokémon being more interchangeable than the games explicitly acknowledge has been a recurring undercurrent of dark lore throughout the franchise's history. Fact 143. Bonnet, the zipper-mouthed ghost puppet, is described as a discarded doll that returned to life through pure hatred. Its entries specify that it is searching for the child who threw it away. It is fueled by a grudge. Its entire existence is defined by abandonment and the desire for reparation or revenge. This is one of the cleaner examples of Pokémon lore using the full emotional weight of a child's relationship with a discarded toy, the specific, slightly irrational guilt that comes from the feeling that a beloved object might somehow know it was left behind. Fact 144. Phantump, introduced in X and Y, is described as a ghost Pokémon created when a child who gets lost in the forest dies there, with their spirit possessing an old tree stump. The entry is precise about this, not that the spirit takes the form of a tree stump, but that a child died in the forest and the tree stump became the vessel for what remained. This is among the bleakest Pokédex entries in the franchise, delivered in the same measured tone as an entry about how much sleep Snorlax requires. Fact 145. Chandeler's entries describe it as absorbing the spirit of anyone burned by its flames, not killing the body but removing the soul, leaving a person alive but hollowed out. The spirit absorbed by Chandelure wanders the world forever, trapped in a state between presence and absence. The body remains. The self does not. The horror here operates on a frequency slightly different from death, something that targets identity rather than existence, leaving behind something that is technically still there but profoundly altered. Fact 146. The Pokédex has occasionally presented information that suggests researchers are not always able to observe or verify what they claim to know. Entries for elusive Pokémon like Mew, Celebi, and Jirachi contain language about rumors, legends, and unverified reports, acknowledging that the scientific database has limits, that some creatures have been seen so rarely that the entries are built from second-hand accounts. This epistemological honesty is a subtle choice that enriches the world-building. The Pokédex is not omniscient. There are things it doesn't know. Some of what it says about rare creatures might be wrong. Fact 147. Trubbish and Garbodor, the garbage bag Pokémon introduced in Black and White, received significant critical attention at the time of their reveal, as examples of Game Freak running out of ideas and simply designing Pokémon out of trash. This criticism missed something. Trubbish and Garbodor are in the same tradition as Voltorb, a Pokéball that became a Pokémon by absorbing electricity in a warehouse, Magnemite and Magneton, living magnets, and Grimer, living pollution. The franchise has always included Pokémon that exist at the boundary between natural and artificial, creatures that emerged from environments shaped by human industry. Trubbish fits that tradition perfectly. Its existence in a game that includes Reshiram and Zekrom is not an anomaly. It's a reminder that the world of Pokémon is fully inhabited, including the parts that aren't beautiful. Fact 148. Volcarona, introduced in Black and White, is described as having served as the sun for ancient humans during a period when volcanic ash blocked out the sky. This Pokédex entry, quiet, factual, describing a moth as having performed the role of the sun for a civilization, is one of the most mythologically resonant in the franchise. There is something enormously evocative about the image of an insect being flying above a darkened world, providing warmth and light to creatures below who had nothing else. It connects directly to Tajiri's original love of insects and to the franchise's deep habit of finding the extraordinary inside the small and the overlooked. Fact 149. The concept of Pokémon having lifespans significantly different from humans has occasionally been addressed in the games in ways that have emotional implications. Ho-Oh is stated to live for 1,000 years. Xerneas is described as having spent 3,000 years as a tree during its dormant state, which explains AZ's 3,000-year history in X and Y. The implications of human characters forming bonds with Pokémon who will vastly outlive them, or in some cases with Pokémon who age and die far faster, are rarely addressed directly in the games, but they create a texture of melancholy in the background of the world that attentive players feel without necessarily being able to articulate. Fact 150. The Pokémon world, across all of its media and games, has never fully resolved the question of what Pokémon are. The games describe a world that was once entirely Pokémon until humans emerged. The mythology of Sinnoh describes Arceus creating the physical universe before anything else existed. The Pokédex contains entries suggesting that some Pokémon are transformed humans. Mew is described as the ancestor of all life on the planet. The world of Pokémon is not a coherently mapped-out cosmology, but an accumulation of mythological fragments from multiple sources that resonate together in interesting ways even where they don't strictly cohere. The result is a world that feels genuinely ancient and genuinely mysterious, the kind of world where you can always feel that there is more to understand than you currently do. Section 14. Localization, language, and what changed across the world. Every version of Pokémon that exists outside Japan is the result of a translation and adaptation process that involved countless small decisions, each of which shaped how the franchise was received and understood in different parts of the world. Localization teams had significant creative latitude in the early years, and they used it. Fact 151. The original Japanese cries for many first-generation Pokémon were noticeably different from what international players heard. Some cries were longer and harsher in the Japanese red and green releases. Charizard's original roar was significantly more guttural than the version Western players received. Game Freak was concerned about how these sounds would register on the Game Boy's tiny built-in speaker, and some cries were adjusted for international release specifically to avoid unpleasant distortion at small speaker sizes. The atmospheric difference this creates is subtle but real. The Japanese versions feel slightly rawer and more confrontational in their audio texture. Fact 152. Pokémon names in different languages tell very different stories about the creatures they describe. In German, Gengar is called Gengar. In French, it is also Gengar. But Jigglypuff is called Rondoudou in French, which translates approximately to round round. Slowpoke is Ramelos in French, implying slowness and loss. Snorlax is Ronflex in French from Ronfleur, meaning snorer. The French localizers leaned heavily into descriptive and onomatopoeic naming in ways that gave the French Pokémon a different personality texture from the English versions, which tended toward puns and portmanteaus. Fact 153. The Japanese anime script was regularly rewritten quite substantially for the English dub, not just translated. 4Kids Entertainment, which handled English dubbing for the first several seasons, made systematic changes to dialogue, tone, and content to suit what they perceived as their American audience's expectations and sensitivities. References to death were altered or removed. Specific cultural details were changed. James's habit of referring to his Pokémon with affectionate suffixes was eliminated. The dubbed Pokémon was, for a significant period, substantially a different show from the Japanese original, sharing the same visuals but built around a different set of creative priorities. Fact 154. Certain Pokémon in different Western languages have names that reflect entirely different cultural associations from the original Japanese. The German name for Eevee is Evoli, which carries a different set of evolutionary connotations than the English name. Umbreon is Nachtara in German, from Nacht, meaning night. Espeon is Siana, a combination of Psychic and Diana, the Roman goddess of the moon. The German names for the Eevee-olutions lean consistently into elemental and mythological naming conventions that feel quite different from the English equivalents, giving the line a different atmosphere in different linguistic contexts. Fact 155. The decision to name the protagonist's rival Gary in the English anime localization was made independently from the games, which offered players the ability to name the rival themselves. The default rival name in the English Red and Blue was Yeti, and you could also name him after various animals. But the anime needed a fixed name, and Gary Oak, grandson of Professor Oak, was born. His English surname connected him to the professor in a way that his Japanese name Shigeru deliberately referenced the Nintendo designer Shigeru Miyamoto without making the reference accessible to English-speaking audiences. Both choices work perfectly for their respective audiences. Neither would have worked in the other language. Fact 156. The famous Indigo League music, the soaring orchestral arrangement that plays during the Elite Four Challenge, was given different emotional weight in different regional dubs of the anime. In Japan, the music had a more melancholy, bittersweet quality that reflected the end of a chapter. In the English dub, the orchestration was replaced with something more triumphant and driving. Both choices reflect real emotional truths about what the Indigo League represents, but they reflect different truths, one about the sadness of endings, one about the excitement of achievement. Section 15, 157 through 200. The final facts. We're in the quiet hours now. Let these last thoughts settle gently. Fact 157. The Pokémon contests introduced in Ruby and Sapphire competitions where Pokémon were judged on beauty, coolness, toughness, cuteness, and smartness were designed as a direct counterpoint to the battle system. Game Freak wanted to create a space in the game where competitive players who preferred aesthetics over strategy could invest their time and attention. The contest hall became one of the franchise's most beloved side activities, and its eventual expansion into Pokémon contests in Diamond and Pearl, with their super contests and full musical performance elements, gave the feature a depth that surprised players who had initially dismissed it as a minor diversion. Fact 158. The Pokémon world's geography across generations has been gradually implied to form a single large continent, or at least a set of connected landmasses through evidence in the games themselves. Connections between regions have been established both narratively and geographically. Kanto and Johto are explicitly adjacent, accessible from each other in gold and silver. Hoenn is separated from these by the sea but connected through the ferry system. The Sinnoh Pokédex contains references to creatures from other regions, as if they are known quantities in the world's scientific literature. Whether all the regions of Pokémon exist on the same planet or across different worlds has been deliberately left ambiguous. Fact 159. The Pokémon franchise has sold over 440 million video games worldwide as of recent counts, making it the best-selling video game franchise in history by units sold. It has also become the highest-grossing media franchise in history when all merchandise, music, film, and card sales are included significantly ahead of every other franchise, including Star Wars and Marvel. All of this from a game that almost didn't get published, built by a team that went unpaid for periods of development, designed around the personal memories of a man who used to catch bugs in the countryside before it was paved over. Fact 160. Ash Ketchum finally won the World Coronation Series in 2023, becoming the official world champion after 25 years of near victories, heartbreaks, and growth. The episode in which this happened was broadcast in Japan in March 2023 and received a genuine cultural moment coverage in mainstream media, enormous emotional response from viewers who had grown up watching Ash lose and come close and try again. Within the year, the anime transitioned to new protagonists Liko and Roy for a new series. Ash's story had ended at its highest possible point. The kid who overslept and started with the Pikachu no one else wanted had become the best in the world. Fact 161. The Pokémon Company celebrated the franchise's 25th anniversary in 2021 with a full orchestral concert that performed music from every generation of the games and anime. The new Pokémon Snap release, the Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl remakes, and Pokémon Legends, Arceus, all launched within that anniversary window, creating a 12-month period that felt in retrospect like a coherent statement about the breadth of what the franchise had become across its history. Fact 162. Pokémon Sleep, a mobile app released in 2023 designed to encourage better sleep by tracking and gamifying sleep patterns, uses Snorlax as its central figure. The most famous sleeping Pokémon in the franchise's history, based on an employee famous for his contentment and his napping, became the mascot for an application designed to make sleep feel rewarding. There is something complete and satisfying about that circle. A joke within the studio about a colleague's sleeping habits turned into a beloved creature, eventually becoming the face of a wellness app about rest. Fact 163. The Poke Flute melody in Red and Blue, used to wake Snorlax blocking the routes between Lavender Town and Celadon City, was composed to match the musical structure of traditional Japanese lullabies. The intention was that the tune should feel inherently soothing, not a harsh noise that forces wakefulness, but a gentle melody that eases transition from deep sleep into gentle wakefulness. Players who knew nothing of this intention still reported finding the Poke Flute sequence unusually pleasant, which is perhaps the best evidence that it worked. Fact 164. The concept of Professor Oak sending trainers on their journey with a Pokédex and a mission, go out there, find every Pokémon, record them all, was Game Freak's translation of the scientific practice of field research into game mechanics. Oak functions as both the game's mentor figure and its designer analog. The person who says, here is a world, and here is a tool, now go and learn everything about it. The invitation to curiosity and comprehensive exploration is embedded in the game's very first conversation. Every Pokémon game since has opened with a version of that same invitation, because the impulse to go out and find everything is the heart of what the franchise is. Fact 165. The Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny characters appearing in the same roles but as apparently different individuals across every city, town, and region of the Pokémon world were designed as visual shorthand that allowed the anime to indicate familiar services and familiar authorities without having to introduce unique characters every single episode. Their similarity across locations was eventually addressed within the show's fiction as a result of large, extended families with traditional occupational roles. It's a charming piece of world-building that started as a production convenience and became a piece of beloved lore. Fact 166. The move counter, which returns double the damage taken from a physical attack, has existed in the franchise since the first generation and was one of the first examples of a reactive strategy mechanic, a move that rewarded prediction and punished aggression. Its existence in the original games, alongside moves like Bide and Mirror Coat, suggests that Game Freak was thinking about the psychological dimension of competitive battle from the very beginning, the game of anticipation and response that underlies all high-level Pokémon play. Fact 167. The franchise's relationship with nature and environmental themes has deepened consistently across generations. The original games gestured at it through the Safari Zone. Ruby and Sapphire made it structural through the Team Magma and Aqua conflict. Black and White made it philosophical through Team Plasma's critique of ownership. Sun and Moon made it personal through the Alola region's deep connection to its ecosystem. Legends. Arceus made it temporal through a story set in the region's ancient past, before the human infrastructure that defines the modern Pokémon world had been built. Each generation has found a new way to ask the same question that motivated the franchise's creation. What is the right relationship between human beings and the living world around them? Fact 168. The Game Boy Link cable, the simple wire that connected two Game Boys and inspired the entire franchise, was discontinued as a product by Nintendo in 2003. By that point, the franchise it had helped create was already one of the most valuable in entertainment history. The cable's function had been absorbed into wireless connectivity, then into global online infrastructure. But the physical object, the wire that looked to Tajiri's imagination like an insect trail between two worlds, is the ancestor of every friend code, every trade screen, every online battle, every wonder trade, every raid lobby in every version of Pokémon that has ever existed. Fact 169. Every core Pokémon game has launched alongside a paired version, Red and Blue, Gold and Silver, Ruby and Sapphire, Diamond and Pearl, Black and White, X and Y, Sun and Moon, Sword and Shield, Scarlet and Violet. The paired release model was designed from the beginning around the link cable mechanic. If you wanted to complete your Pokédex, you needed to trade with someone who owned the other version. This requirement encoded social connection into the game's very completion condition. You literally could not do it alone. The most isolated form of engagement the franchise offered still pointed toward other people. Fact 170. The connection between Tajiri's childhood and the core design of Pokémon is not metaphorical but literal. The game is structured around catching small creatures in the wild. You build a collection, you name them. You understand their properties. You trade them with friends. You find rare ones in unexpected places. You build an encyclopedia of everything you find. The Game Boy is a pond, the Pokeball is a jar, the wild grass is the undergrowth at the edge of the field where beetles hide under fallen leaves. The whole thing is an artifact of one child's specific, deeply felt relationship with the natural world of his own childhood, a relationship that urbanization threatened to make impossible, and that the franchise has been preserving in electronic amber ever since. Fact 171. Mewtwo's origin story, a creature cloned from Mew, engineered to be the most powerful Pokémon ever created, which broke free from its laboratory and had to grapple with what it meant to exist outside of the purpose it was built for, is one of the franchise's deepest and most recurring thematic concerns. The question of what we owe to the things we create and what those things owe to us runs through Mewtwo's arc in both the anime films and the original games. It also runs, quietly, through almost every story in the franchise about a Pokemon's relationship with a trainer, the question of whether care and partnership constitute something worth having, or whether freedom from all constraint is worth more. Fact 172. The Pokemon world does not have cities with traditional hospitals for humans, at least not ones that players visit. The closest equivalent is the Pokémon Center, which heals Pokemon and provides some services. The implication that the human medical system and the Pokemon care system have become deeply intertwined, or that, in the world of Pokemon, Pokemon healing and human healing have effectively merged is never explicitly addressed, but it adds a texture of genuine strangeness to the world's internal logic. Fact 173. The franchise's core theme, that partnership between humans and non-human creatures has inherent and irreplaceable value, has remained consistent across every generation, every medium, every platform. The games have changed dramatically in scope and ambition. The anime has cycled through different leads and settings. The trading card game has evolved through dozens of mechanical revisions. The mythology has grown from 151 to over 1,000 creatures. But every version of Pokémon is still, at its core, a story about the relationship between a person and a creature that is not a person, and what each becomes through knowing the other. Fact 174. Pikachu's voice, the specific vocalization of the Japanese voice actress Ikue Otani, who has played the character since 1997, is one of the most recognizable sounds in global entertainment. Otani has voiced Pikachu in the Japanese version of the anime across 25-plus years, in dozens of films, in video games, and in promotional material. She does this exclusively through variations of the syllable Pika and the word Pikachu, modulating pitch, tempo, and emotional inflection to convey an extraordinary range of meaning. The voice has become so embedded in cultural memory that most people who have never seen the anime would recognize it immediately. Fact 175. When Pokémon Red and Blue first launched in North America in September 1998, they came bundled with a promotional offer for a Mew distribution event at Toys R Us stores. Players who showed up to these events and connected their Game Boys received a Mew downloaded directly to their cartridge, the first officially distributed event Pokémon in the franchise's history. The lines outside Toys R Us locations for these events were long enough that they made local news in several markets. It was the first indication that Pokémon events were going to be a phenomenon in themselves, separate from the games but dependent on them. Fact 176. The Fairy type, introduced in Generation 6's X and Y, was added partly as a balance adjustment for the Dragon type, which had been consistently overpowered across multiple generations. But its design also served a narrative purpose. Fairy-type Pokémon tend to be associated with mythology, magic, and the ancient world in ways that gave the type a sense of cultural depth that purely mechanical types like Normal or Flying didn't carry. Clefable, Togekiss, Sylveon, Mimikyu the Fairy type accumulated a roster of creatures who felt like they belonged to a specific register of old stories about magical beings who existed at the edge of the human world. Fact 177. The concept of held items objects that Pokémon could carry to enhance their performance in battle was introduced in Gold and Silver and has remained central to competitive play ever since. The Choice Band, the Leftovers, the Life Orb, the Focus Sash, these items, and dozens of others define entire strategies and archetypes in competitive play. The system that began with something as simple as a berry that could heal you mid-battle eventually became one of the most complex strategic layers in the franchise, generating analyses and discussions that continue across multiple generations of competitive players. Fact 178. The Pokémon Gym system regional challenges administered by specialized trainers, each focusing on a specific type, arranged in approximate order of difficulty, and leading toward a final league challenge is one of the most elegant structural designs in the history of role-playing games. It provides clear goals, visible progress, meaningful rewards, thematic coherence, and an ordered sense of world exploration. It was designed in the original games and has remained the template for every mainline series entry until the Island Trials of Sun and Moon introduced a partial variation. The gym system works so well that its occasional modifications feel notable precisely because the original template is so strong. Fact 179. Pokémon has been subject to a number of cultural controversies that reveal something about how deeply the franchise embedded itself in global consciousness. Some religious groups in the early 2000s argued that the games promoted occult themes. Some geopolitical controversies emerged around regional variant designs and naming conventions. The Jinx design controversy, the Porygon incident. Each of these controversies was resolved differently, but they all demonstrated the same underlying reality. Pokémon had become important enough to people that what it did and said and depicted genuinely mattered to them. You only get that kind of controversy about things people actually care about. Fact 180. The games have never depicted Pokémon as anything other than willing, or at least capable of willingness, in their partnerships with trainers. Even antagonist-owned Pokémon, Cyrus's Pokémon, Lysandre's Pokémon, the Shadow Pokémon of Ore, are depicted as beings whose natural state is one of connection and partnership. The Shadow Pokémon mechanic specifically frames their corruption as an unnatural imposition, something done to them against their nature. The franchise has consistently proposed that the relationship between a Pokémon and a caring trainer is not exploitation, but genuine partnership. An answer to the question N asks in black and white, even if it's not the last word on the subject. Fact 181. The franchise has produced 47 theatrical films as of recent counts, ranging from the gravity of Mewtwo Strikes Back to the gentle comedy of I Choose You's reimagining of Ash and Pikachu's first meeting. The theatrical films gave the franchise its largest-scale storytelling opportunities and its most dramatic visual moments. The image of Mewtwo standing in the rain, the image of Ash turned to stone, and Pikachu crying over him, the image of Lugia surfacing from the ocean, these are among the most visually iconic moments in the franchise's history, and they exist only because the films gave the storytellers a bigger canvas. Fact 182. Pokémon Legends Arceus, released in January 2022, represented the most dramatic departure from the franchise's established template since its inception. Set in ancient Hisui, the precursor of the Sinnoh region, the game presented a world before the systems and structures of the modern Pokémon world had been developed. Pokeballs were being invented in real time. Pokémon and humans were not yet partners in the familiar sense. They were creatures of the wild, alien, and sometimes terrifying to the people who encountered them. The game asked what the relationship between humans and Pokémon looked like before it became what every other game in the franchise had always taken for granted. The answer was something more precarious, more genuinely dangerous, and in a specific way more beautiful. Fact 183. The franchise's use of regional variants Pokémon that evolved differently in different geographical environments, exhibiting different types, different appearances, and different behaviors began with Alolan forms in Sun and Moon, and has continued in every subsequent generation. The concept gave old Pokémon new relevance and added ecological and evolutionary texture to the world. An Alolan Ninetales covered in frost, adapted to snowy mountains. An Alolan Raichu surfing on its own electric tail, adapted to a beach culture. The regional variants don't just change type charts, they tell small stories about how creatures adapt to their environments over time, which is exactly the kind of scientific thinking about the natural world that Tajiri built the franchise to celebrate. Fact 184. The franchise's competitive scene organized battle formats, ranked play, official world championships has grown into one of the most structured competitive gaming scenes in the world. The Pokémon World Championships, held annually, attract players from over 60 countries and receive official support from the Pokémon Company. The competitive community has developed its own vocabulary, its own archetypes, its own famous players and legendary moments. It exists in parallel with the casual experience of the games in a way that most major gaming franchises don't achieve genuinely accessible at the surface level while maintaining extraordinary depth for those who pursue it. Fact 185. The original Game Boy on which Pokémon Red and Green launched had a screen so reflective and poorly backlit that it was essentially unplayable in most indoor lighting conditions, without positioning yourself at a specific angle under a lamp. Children who loved these games developed elaborate postures and spatial arrangements in their rooms to catch enough light to see what was happening on screen. The franchise's first 15 years of existence, the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance era were all built around hardware that required specific environmental conditions to use. There is something appropriate about Pokemon's origins, requiring you to turn toward the light. Fact 186. Totodile, the water-type starter of Gold and Silver, was designed with a disproportionately large mouth for its body. This was intentional. The designers wanted a creature that seemed to lead with its jaw, that expressed enthusiasm physically through its face. The personality this created, of a small creature with enormous energy concentrated in its bite, made Totodile one of the most beloved starters in the franchise. Its anime counterpart, catching everything in sight with its outsized mouth, became one of the most memorable supporting Pokémon in the show's early seasons. Fact 187. The use of music in Pokémon games has been one of the franchise's most consistent and most celebrated qualities. Junichi Masuda, who served as the series' lead composer in its early years before transitioning to producing and directing roles, approached the game's soundtrack as world-building rather than mere accompaniment. Different cities had musical identities that reflected their characters. The battle themes were designed to create specific emotional states. Lavender Town's music, the Gym Leader battle theme, the Elite Four progression, the legendary Pokémon encounter theme. These compositions are deeply embedded in the emotional memory of a generation of players who heard them during formative years. Fact 188. The phrase, "I want to be the very best," like no one ever was, from the English opening theme of the anime is perhaps the most direct and memorable articulation of what Pokémon is about, but it is a localization decision, not a translation. The Japanese theme song, Mezaze Pokémon Master, focuses on friendship, adventure, and the journey rather than achievement and competition. The English theme transformed the emotional center of gravity from the relationship between Ash and his Pokémon toward the goal of becoming the best. Both versions accurately describe something real about the franchise, but they describe different somethings. Fact 189. The tradition of certain Pokémon games, including a third version after the initial paired release, Yellow, Crystal, Emerald, Platinum, served as both a commercial strategy and a creative opportunity. The third versions typically included enhanced storylines, additional Pokémon availability, and features that the first pair hadn't fully developed. They also typically included a distinct mascot legendary not featured in the paired release. Yellow enhanced the Pikachu experience directly, Crystal introduced Suicune more prominently, Emerald featured Rayquaza as its central legendary, Platinum gave Giratina its own form and environment. The third version tradition was eventually replaced by the DLC model used in Sword and Shield and beyond. Fact 190. The friendship mechanic, the invisible measure of how much a Pokémon cares for its trainer, has been in the franchise since the first Pikachu experiments in Yellow, and then formalized in Gold and Silver. It affects evolution for certain Pokémon, and in later games it affects the power of moves like Return. It is also entirely invisible to players who don't seek it out. You can play through an entire Pokémon game without knowing it exists. For players who do discover it, it reframes every interaction with your team as meaningful in a way the game never requires you to notice but allows you to feel. Fact 191. The global impact of Pokémon Go in the summer of 2016 was remarkable not just for its commercial success, but for what it did to public space. Parks that had previously been quiet filled with people of all ages walking and looking at their phones. Strangers talked to each other. Businesses adapted to foot traffic that appeared seemingly from nowhere. The game was downloaded over 100 million times in its first month, a record at the time. It demonstrated in the most concrete possible way that the impulse at the core of Pokémon, go outside, find things, collect them, share what you find with others, was not nostalgic or childish, but fundamentally appealing to people across age groups and demographics. Fact 192. Pokémon cards became the subject of a renewed collecting frenzy in 2020 and 2021, with prices for first edition and rare vintage cards increasing dramatically. A base set first edition holographic Charizard card sold at auction for over $500,000 in December 2020. The broader economic disruption of the pandemic period created conditions where collectibles generally appreciated in value, and Pokémon cards objects that millions of adults had as children and attached genuine emotional memory to benefited enormously from this dynamic. Sealed packs from vintage sets became investment instruments. The cultural weight of those childhood objects had not dissipated. It had simply been deferred until circumstances allowed it to be expressed financially. Fact 193. The concept of the Pokémon Master, the goal that Ash articulates and pursues across 25 years of anime, is never fully defined in the show. What does it mean to be a Pokémon Master? The games have a functional definition: defeat the Elite Four and the champion, and become champion yourself. But in the anime, being champion of a regional league clearly isn't sufficient. The concept implies something broader and more personal. A state of deep partnership with Pokémon, of total mutual understanding that transcends any competitive ranking. Ash's eventual World Championship title in 2023 was emotionally satisfying, not because it provided a functional definition of mastery, but because it felt like a culmination of everything he had built across 2 decades of relationships. Fact 194. The franchise's expansion to over 900 Pokémon has frequently been criticized as evidence of diminishing creativity. The counter-argument is that the designs across the latest generations include some of the most conceptually interesting creatures in the franchise's history. Mimikyu, a creature so desperate for love that it covered itself in a Pikachu disguise; Toxtricity, a heavy metal lizard; Dragapult, a stealth aircraft Pokémon that launches Baby Dreepy from its headwings as living projectiles. The later generations had access to a broader range of design influences and a more sophisticated understanding of what made Pokémon designs memorable, and they used both. Fact 195. The Pokémon franchise has been the subject of serious academic study across disciplines including sociology, psychology, environmental philosophy, media studies, and game design. Researchers have studied how Pokémon shaped childhood social dynamics, the role of the franchise in the globalization of Japanese culture, the ethical implications of the game's creature ownership mechanics, and the cognitive patterns involved in Pokémon recognition across age groups. The franchise that started in Tajiri's rural childhood has become a text that scholars and students in multiple fields use to examine how entertainment shapes values, identity, and social behavior. Fact 196. The Pokémon Company, established in 1998 to manage the franchise's expanding media properties, is jointly owned by Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc., the 3 entities whose collaboration created the original games. This ownership structure has remained stable across nearly 30 years and has given the franchise unusual continuity compared to intellectual properties managed entirely by large corporations. The original designers still have significant influence over what Pokémon becomes. Tajiri, though less directly involved in day-to-day development than he was in the early years, remains the franchise's president and originating creative force. Fact 197. The legendary Pokémon of each generation have consistently served as anchors for that generation's mythology and its themes. The birds of Kanto were elemental guardians. The beasts of Johto were resurrected witnesses to tragedy. The Regigolems of Hoenn were ancient sealed constructs of uncertain origin. The Sinnoh creation trio presided over the universe's birth. The dragon ideology pair of Unova embodied conflicting truths about the world. The Kalos weapons were designed to power an ancient superweapon. The Alola Guardians were family. The Tapu were patron deities of specific islands who had genuine relationships with the people who lived there. Each generation's legendary design tells you something about what that generation wanted to say about the world. Fact 198. The franchise has produced its own composer tradition. Junichi Masuda defined the sonic identity of the early games. Hitomi Sato contributed distinctive work to later generations. The Game Freak sound team across generations has maintained an extraordinary level of musical quality across hundreds of tracks in each game, working within the significant technical constraints of the hardware available at each period. The music of Pokémon is among the most analyzed and celebrated in gaming, generating arrangement concerts, vinyl collections, fan reimaginings, and genuine academic attention from musicologists interested in how games use music to create and sustain emotional environments. Fact 199. The Pokeball, the device that captures and stores Pokémon, is one of the most elegant design objects in fiction. Its function is implied by its shape: spherical, activatable, containment without burden. It collapses to a size that fits in a pocket. It opens with a touch. The technology behind it is left deliberately mysterious in the games and anime. We see what it does without being told how it does it. This opacity is a gift. The Pokeball works as well as it does in the franchise's imagination because we are never given enough information to doubt it. It is simply the thing that Pokémon live inside, and its design is so clean and recognizable that it has become one of the most widely recognized symbols in global entertainment. Fact 200. The franchise has now spanned 30 years, encompassing more than 1,000 individual Pokémon, hundreds of games and films and manga volumes and card sets and anime episodes, and the cultural memories of multiple generations of humans who grew up with it, came back to it, and brought their own children to it. It began with one person's specific, deeply felt experience of a world that was disappearing around him. Fields being paved, ponds being filled in, the insects retreating before the advance of the city. He found a way to preserve that experience in a game, to pass the joy of finding and cataloging small living things to children who would never see the countryside of his Machida childhood. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Not just for a season or a generation, but across the entirety of the modern world, in 100 languages, on every continent, in the hands of people who will never meet Tajiri and who carry something of his childhood forward without knowing it. There is something genuinely beautiful about that. The tall grass is quiet now, the Pokémon are sleeping, the roots are empty, and the towns are dark, and the only light is the glow of whatever screen you're watching this on, somewhere in the world, at whatever hour it is where you are. 200 facts about a franchise built from a child's love of catching bugs in a suburban countryside that no longer exists. 200 windows into the layered, strange, improbable history of something that became, somehow, one of the most beloved things human beings have made. If any of this gave you something to dream about tonight, or something to think about when you close your eyes, then this has done exactly what it set out to do. Sleep well. And if you enjoyed the journey here, a like and a subscribe mean more than you know, and they help this channel keep making content like this. Drop a comment before you drift off. Let someone know you were here, that you listened, that somewhere in the world, at whatever hour it is, you spent some time in the Pokémon universe. That counts for something. Good night.